Good morning, everyone. Good morning. We are so pleased and excited that you were able to share this time with us and hear some of the great presentations and great ideas and concepts and understand also some of the complications or complexities associated with achievement, particularly within our public schools. This is the Urban League Massachusetts Equity and Excellence Summit. So summit means you're going to do more than just listen, that you're going to participate by asking questions and giving feedbacks. If you're called on to ask a question, try not to make a speech. Ask the question. There's some trick buttons around the auditorium that if someone is making a speech that we just have to push it and you get ejected. But don't worry about it. We want to also welcome a number of out-of-town guests who will be presenting, and some are just here because they live in the state of Massachusetts and they care about public education. And so, but we have presenters from New Orleans. We're going to have the conference, we're going to have the summit there next year. But from New Orleans, from New York, from Boston, Washington, D.C., and am I forgetting? Travis is not listening to me as you. Yeah.
That's a good opportunity. There's one more housekeeping item. It's very important.
That's right.
So we have a number of Spanish-speaking individuals. If we do have a live translator, if you could please stand. If you are in need of specific translation services, just make your way down and have a seat in this vicinity, and we'll make sure that anything that's not quite clear gets properly translated.
Okay. The other thing we want to do is to thank WTCC radio station. We've made arrangements for them to cover the summit broadcast live. And so let's give WTCC a hand. So there are a number of people who could not make it for different reasons or couldn't make the whole thing, and they'll have an opportunity to take it in on WTCC. The other thing is that Focus, the community cable station, which is a station that is created by Comcast revenues that come in. A certain percentage of their revenues goes towards community access, which is a great return to the community. John Abbott is the principal at Focus, and they are filming the summit as well. It won't be live, but they will play it later. And I'll have a conversation with Comcast to see if other Massachusetts cities where they have their footprint can see and listen to the great exchanges that we're going to witness today. So for Focus. So the Urban League is not in this by itself with respect to sponsorship. We have two incredibly dedicated partners that are thinking about and working towards education excellence and equity every day. And one, I'm going to ask them to come up as I introduce them from the mic here, but John Davis, who is the senior trustee for the Irene E. and George A. Davis Foundation, and Mary Wallachie, who is the executive director of the foundation, are here, and they're going to be our co-partners. So you guys come on up. Listen. Mary's real smart. She sends the boss up to get the camera work. Yeah. So we want to thank John, and then we're fortunate to have from all the way from Washington, D.C. I didn't mention Washington. I knew there was a reason that I should have thought of another city. But we have Dr. Len Jennings, who is the Director of National and State Partnerships from the Education Trust, our other co-partner. Come on up. So we're, the subtext of this summit was, or is, how are the children? Some of you may know this, but in East Africa, there's a tribe called the Maasai warriors. And they have a traditional way of greeting one another. It's not, yo. It's not, hey, dude. It's not, hey, what's up? It's not, how are you doing? They greet each other by asking, how are the children? So there's a couple things that's very powerful in how are the children greeting. One, there's a mutual acknowledgement that what's more important than even us in the moment is the children, and how are they doing is important feedback that they are receiving at that time, in that moment. But the other thing that's very important is that when you say how the children are doing, they already know how I'm doing. They already know how your family's doing. They already know how what folks in your circle are doing if the children are doing well. And so that's what we want to try to achieve, is that we care more than just ourselves, that we care about the children to the extent that we're willing to be equity warriors, to ensure that they get the best and the highest quality education that's available, and that they don't have to be delayed by various performance gaps, preparation gaps, resource gaps, opportunity gaps. We want to close the gaps. No ceilings on success. And so that's what the Urban League subscribes to. That is what all of you obviously subscribe to, because that's why you're in the room, and that's why we're going to have a great day in sharing information. So I want to introduce Len again from Ed Trust, and we're going to let her do her thing. She is extremely committed and dynamic in her presence around the country and really spreading the gospel of equity and excellence. And so we're happy to have you with us, Len. And John and I are going to sit down. We can.
Oh, thank you, Henry, and good morning, everyone. Excuse me, I'm a little bit battling a little bit of a cold, so if I have to go get some water, excuse me. I just want to welcome everyone to this really important discussion that we're having this morning. We want to spend today thinking about exactly what Henry said, how are the children, and how we can become stronger and smarter advocates for children in the state of Massachusetts and across the country. At the Education Trust, we pride ourselves on being fierce advocates for students of color and low-income students throughout the whole education system. So that's P through 12 and in higher education. Our advocacy work is grounded in research, it's grounded in policy, and we look at these things very specifically through an equity lens. What is happening to the children, the students who too often have been neglected, ignored, historically underserved, discriminated against, et cetera. We do this by and then we want to identify the opportunity gaps and the preparation gaps, as Henry says, that lead to what we often talk about in terms of the achievement gap. As a national organization, our work doesn't have real meaning unless we have partnerships with people like you in this room. We can't make this work. We can do all the analysis that we want to in the world, do all the research we want to do, but if it's not affecting what's happening in our schools and for the students and the children in the school, then it's not worth doing all of this work. And so I say that to say I really want to thank again the Urban League and Springfield and Davis Foundation for being partners for this meeting today. Thank you. So our president and CEO, John B. King, couldn't be here this morning. He had a previous commitment that he couldn't move, but he made it very clear that he needed to be here some way, somehow. So he is going to give, he sent with me welcoming remarks via video. And so we have a video message from him. But before we do that, I just want to give a really brief introduction of him, which seems weird without having him here on the stage. But because I think some of you are probably familiar with John's work here in Massachusetts. His roots in education started right here in this state. He began his career in education after he graduated from Harvard with a BA in government. Then he became a social studies teacher in middle school, became a principal, and then he was also very much part of the leadership of the Roxbury Preparatory Charter School. Under his leadership with the prep students, they attained the highest state exam scores of any urban middle school in the state of Massachusetts. He closed the racial achievement gap, and his students outperformed not only the Boston district schools, but also the city's most affluent suburbs. He took all of this work and all that he learned here in Massachusetts back to his home state of New York, and that's where he was appointed Commissioner of Education of New York, and then later we got to know him in DC when he became our 10th US Secretary of Education under the Obama administration. After the Obama administration, we at Trust got super happy and lucky when he joined our team and became our leader at the Education Trust. And so that's a little bit enough of hearing about John, but I want to, and so now we'll go to his video with him giving his welcome remarks to you this morning.
Hi, I'm John King, former U.S. Secretary of Education and CEO and President of the Education Trust. I'm honored to join the Commonwealth Education Equity Summit, and I'm grateful to the Urban League of Springfield for convening this group today. 25 years ago, the Massachusetts Education Reform Act was signed into law, and since then, Massachusetts has been held up as a model of educational excellence in the United States. However, what this group knows all too well is that behind the high rankings, Massachusetts low-income students and students of color continue to be denied the same opportunities provided to their white, more affluent peers. The data do not lie. In Massachusetts, just 49% of low-income 3- and 4-year-olds are enrolled in early childhood programs, compared to 64% of affluent children. 40% of students in the state are students of color, but just 8% of educators are educators of color. Black and Latino students are more than 3 times as likely to be suspended out of school as white students. These disparities in opportunity from preschool through grade 12 result in gaps in academic achievement from high school graduation rates to college enrollment and success. These are the glaring gaps that compel the advocates in this room to work tirelessly to advance educational equity and justice. And for that, I am grateful. Massachusetts students benefit from advocates like Henry Thomas, leader of Springfield's Urban League. Henry has been rolling up his sleeves for years, calling attention to persistent and profound inequities in educational excellence and equity from preschool through higher education. We at the Education Trust are proud to stand alongside advocates from the civil rights, social justice, and education communities in the Massachusetts Education Equity Partnership, and to issue the report, number 1 for some, to make clear that there is no excellence in education without equity in education. We look forward to expanding these partnerships to include more families, business leaders, educators, and those in the local community. As Secretary of Education under President Obama, I led the department with the firm belief that the agency's mission was to advance and protect the civil rights of all students. I believe that a quality education must be extended to every child, regardless of zip code, religion, LGBTQ status, income, immigration status, language spoken at home, or race. The prosperity of our nation and of our democracy hinge on how we educate and care for those among us who have been historically underserved. Number One for Some puts a magnifying glass on the data with the message that in Massachusetts we can and must do more for these students. It simply isn't enough to be number one for some in a nation where our collective future is bound up in the success of all people. So I want to thank you all for being here and for being loud and adamant about the challenges that Massachusetts continues to face. I want to thank those state leaders in the room, including Commissioner of Higher Education Carlos Santiago and Mayor Dominic Sarno. I'd like to thank John Davis of the Irene and George Davis Foundation for their support, and Paul Revel, former Massachusetts Secretary of Education and a key contributor to the Massachusetts Education Reform Act. I'm confident that state leaders and advocates in this room will continue to work together. Please know that the Education Trust is prepared to help and join you in this work. And I look forward to everything that the partnership will achieve in service to all students across Massachusetts.
Thank you, Dr. King. I want to recognize a couple people in the audience before we bring on our next presenter or next person giving remarks. And President Harry Dumais, president of the Elms College in Chicopee, Massachusetts, my wife's alma mater. President Dumais. He's still new, folks, so we'll see what happens next year. And then I seen Ramon Terracilla, president of Westfield State College. There we are, Ramon. Dr. Terracilla. And we have, I saw Dan Warwick, our superintendent of schools in Springfield, Massachusetts. Dan, hey. Right. And his deputy, Lydia. Yeah. And I think, any other college presidents in the house? Okay. Any other college president wannabes in the house? This next person is not difficult for me to bring up and talk about, but I'm going to minimize my talking and let him do the talking. But there's no one more committed to education, equity, and excellence than John Davis and the Family Foundation, the Davis Foundation. No greater example than a new early childhood center that he is spearheading with some other donors to make happen, not in the suburbs, but in the hood. And so for that, we thank you, John Davis. And John, come on up and make your remarks, please. I've been told we have to talk with the mic in our hand.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me? Yes. Oh, good. Well, thank you, Henry, and welcome everyone. I'm glad to see we've got a big turnout tonight, this morning, and we've got a lot to go over, and I think you're going to find it very rewarding. You know, Len Jennings and John King talked about this achievement gap, and one of the things in a city like Springfield, this achievement gap starts to show up very early. As a matter of fact, studies have been done across the country that tell us that many urban students come to school with 1/10 the vocabulary of their suburban students. So they come at a real disadvantage. You know, fortunately, this is something that can be mitigated, and with a lot of work and with intervention, primarily through pre-K work, we can bring these young people up to where they need to be to enter kindergarten. 10 years ago, many of us in Springfield started to get together to talk about pre-K and what we could do to really boost the pre-K work that we were doing in the city. You know, pre-K is not mandated in Massachusetts yet. We're working on that. But I believe around 50% of the students in the city attend some type of pre-K. And the pre-K in the city is, some of it is sponsored by the school district, but we also have a lot of private providers. Well, we brought together these different schools, started to talk about what are the needs that they all saw to make sure that our young people get the skills that they need. And one of the first things that we came up with was the workforces of many of our pre-K teachers. They needed some help in instruction. Many of the pre-K teachers were parents themselves. They got interested in pre-K through their own children, but they didn't have degrees. So the community got together and we started to work with the local colleges, and we were able to put some programs together where we brought a lot of the people in the system first for a associate's degree, and then many went on to bachelor's degrees. We know that the more education we can give our teachers, the better they are going to be in the classroom. While we were doing this, we had an unfortunate, and one of our private providers went out of business in Mason Square. There were a lot of kids up there, very young kids. But fortunately, I think because of all the work we had done with the community, the school districts, the mayors, Dominic Sarno and Dan Warwick got together and were able to purchase that building and keep that facility going. We put in more district pre-K, and we also have invited in some of the private providers that are in that same building, and this has been a big help to the community. We also started to look at, well, what's happening in other communities? I'm a big believer in not reinventing the wheel. And we started to go out across the country to look at who's got some good pre-K programs. And one of the first we came across was a group called Educare. There's 28 of these across the country. We went out to Nebraska to look at one of them. Also, we went up to Maine. There's one in Maine. There's none in Massachusetts, Connecticut, or Vermont, or Rhode Island. But we started to learn about Educare, and became very obvious that this was one of the top programs in the country. And immediately we saw that, we said, boy, we got to get that to Springfield. Unfortunately, when we started to look at it, to be able to do that involved about $13 million. So that kind of set us back. We had a quiet plane ride home from Chicago, Mary and myself saying, boy, where are we going to find $13 million? So about for 6 months, we scratched our heads, and we didn't really come up with an awful lot. But you got to believe in miracles, and sure enough, one day we got notified an anonymous donor who does not live in Springfield, it's a woman, that's all I know, is willing to give us $9 million. Well, that changed the conversation immediately, and we started out and we started to raise the rest of the funds, and as of right this moment, we are building a new Educare facility on Hickory Street in Springfield. There are a lot of people involved in this. And this pre-K will start at birth. There'll be young babies in there right through to kindergarten students. And we're really excited about this. There are a lot of people who worked on this. The school district, the city, Springfield College donated the property, gave us, I think we got a 50-year lease on the property. And we're building the building as we speak, and this is going to be great. And the idea behind this is we're going to have this great facility, but we're also going to work with the rest of our pre-K community to help train them so they can become better providers. So, you know, we know that it's really critical by 4th grade we get our students to be able to read. You know, from pre-K through 4th grade, we're teaching our students to read. After 4th grade, our students learn by reading, and it's critical that we really get our kids up to par so they can teach themselves, really, to be able to read. You know, the statistics right at the moment, we've made some progress, but we have a lot of work to do. Today in the city of Springfield, 33% of our 3rd graders are at grade level reading. As we look at some of the suburban cities, that number is 66, so you can see some of the gap. But we are working here, the district's working very hard, and the community's working very hard to see if we can start to shrink that. I think we can. Having pre-K is a critical portion of that. We need mandatory pre-K. We've got a lot of discussion in the state here of putting some additional funds into education. I'd like to encourage the district and the city to really look at putting substantial amount of money into pre-K so we can offer it for really all our kids. This is the way we can get them caught up. You know, some people think, look at urban centers and don't think these kids can learn. It's not true. As John King pointed out, he took this school in Boston and really brought it up. So his students were some of the best performing students in that Boston area. And that's a real high competition area, let me tell you. Some of those schools in around Boston are some of the best schools in the country and maybe some of the best schools in the world. But urban kids can perform that level. We just have to do the work. It's a lot of work. There's a lot more to do. And I think we'll learn more about it today. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I think John Davis deserves another round of applause for closing the gap on that $13 million. Great job, John. I want to recognize a couple of other people before we bring on our next speaker. I think next week is payday, so it's a payday week, so I want to recognize the chairman of the Urban League Board of Trustees, the Right Reverend Dr. W.C. Watson. And while I'm at it, the chair of our finance committee, Roland Holstead, on the board. And I see new board member, president of the WGBY public TV station, Anthony Hayes. Welcome aboard. I'm going to turn it over to Len again so she can bring on our next speaker. Thank you.
Okay, so we spent the morning setting up the context, talking a lot about the opportunity gaps, the preparation gaps. Excuse me, as I've already said, advocacy groups like ours are often doing the pushing, nudging, shoving folks to make sure that they're paying attention to this. But we also know that there are people who are thinking about these issues every day and who are working on them. And so it is with great pleasure that I get to introduce Dr. Ventura Rodriguez from the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. We know that he's working every day to think about how we can close some of these gaps. And so we thought he could share this morning a little bit about the state's work in doing this.
Good morning. I'm actually going to be very brief. Just wanted to first of all say, again, I'm really thrilled to be a part of this event, and our Commissioner Jeff Riley asked me to be here to be able to communicate our firm commitment as a department to supporting all students. You know, I was recently appointed Senior Associate Commissioner for Strategic Initiatives. And what the commissioners asked me to do is essentially say, look, we recognize as a department, we've been working a lot on this over the past many years, but we absolutely recognize that while we've served some students really, really well in our state, we've not served all of our students. We, as the sort of main group in the state that is charged with leading some of this work, also recognize that it's a lot of the people in this room, really our district leaders, our school leaders, who are doing the work every single day. So our job is how can we provide support, resources, the right environment for this work to flourish. As we think about who we haven't served well, as an agency, we name specifically African American and Latino leaders, or students. We don't have to show the stats. I think the stats have been shared, but we as an agency are very clear on that. When we think of low income students, special education students, language learners, again, we know as a state, even though when we go outside of Massachusetts and people say, wow, you're number one, if we looked at you compared to other education systems, you'd be one of the top performing. Just so you know, the conversations within the department are not about that. The conversations are about what are we gonna do to make sure that we're serving all kids well. So in my role, and I think it's significant not just because of me, the individual, but our commissioner has asked me to really say, look, we're not gonna make the kind of achievement that we want in this area unless we really name it and go after it. So part of the work that I've been charged with is to help our state agency figure out what is gonna be our explicit strategy to go ahead and actually try to do what we're saying we need to do, which is provide much better opportunities and increase outcomes for historically underserved kids. We're gonna be working with a lot of you. We're gonna be reaching out to a lot of you because we know you've been on the front lines and are leading the work. And the last thing we wanna do is, be on a policy level so removed that we're not actually understanding the local context really well so that we're supporting all of you in the work. We think about human capital. We think about the need to diversify the educator workforce in Massachusetts. And we think about the need of providing training, which we do, but we need to expand to all educators so that they're able to really recognize the values of all of our kids. We recognize that even within the department, when I sit in a meeting at the department, the room doesn't look this diverse. I'm oftentimes one of the only brown folks in the room, and we can't make policy if we don't have all stakeholders and all groups represented. So again, we recognize that. And so we're doing work internally, even at the department, to think about our hiring practices, our policies, and what kind of training we need to do so that when we're supporting development of policy, it's really done with a skill set and a lens that's much more inclusive. Funding's important. Okay, at the department, we don't control all of the Chapter 70 funding, for example, but our commissioners made it clear, and we stand behind this, that absolutely funding matters. And so any work that is happening at the state level to think about not only how we provide more funding, but how we provide funding in a way that tries to address issues of equity really, really matter. And so I'm here more than anything to listen, to learn. We are a partner in this work with you. We are absolutely committed and positioned to really try to take education reform to the next level in Massachusetts so it serves all kids. And so with that, I just look forward to the rest of this day, any opportunities that I have to engage with you all individually or as a group. Because I've only been in Massachusetts about 5 years, but even though these are challenges across the country, there's a belief that in Massachusetts, we'll figure it out. We're gonna get it done. We've done a lot of good work over the last 25 years and even before. I'm really excited to be a part of this challenge to really make sure how do we educate all of our kids. Thank you.
Thank you. And we also know we don't stop with P through 12, right? How important post-secondary training education is. And we often talk about in terms of not only when we have high school graduates that get to college, which is your access, but then you want success. They need to complete college. And so it's my pleasure to introduce the Deputy Commissioner for Academic Affairs and Student Success at the Massachusetts Department of Higher Education, Patricia Marshall.
Looks like Patricia Marshall is delayed. Commissioner Marshall is delayed. So you have me. to bring on the next guest. I want to acknowledge Urban League staff. This doesn't happen by it just happening. It happens just because you have competent, dedicated, tireless staff members that put their nose to the grindstone and do what has to be done. And so, Travis Ray, want to acknowledge Travis. Most of the presenters know Travis real well. I call him Dr. Detail. And Andrew Kay, the voice of Western Massachusetts. Andrew, we did a radio interview with Len Jennings this morning, and I warned her about Andrew's voice being as melodious and strong and vibrant. Then I started crying because I don't have it. But anyhow, so Andrew. And then we have the rest of our staff. Senior Vice President Yvette Frisbee, I think I saw up there, helping out. There she is. There. Yeah. And the rest of the folk. So we're glad. What's the, the beauty of this room? What the beauty of this room is? Since I got a little bit of time that should have been taken by somebody else, and I'm sure she'll make it before the day is out. But the beauty of this room is we are all stakeholders. It's not just the parents that are stakeholders in quality, excellence, and equity. It's the business community. It's the people working here at the Basketball Hall of Fame. It's teachers. It's all of us. And the challenge that we have is that people who don't seem to have a connection with schools because they don't have maybe children in schools or grands in schools, public schools, they don't see themselves as stakeholders. But the quality of life for them directly correlates with the quality of the educational system in the communities in which they live. And so if we can get that point across, that we are all stakeholders, we all have something to gain, we all have something to lose if it doesn't go right. So if you take a look at elections, city elections, I think it's almost criminal that we have less than 10% of the electorate voting, number one, and even less percentage voting on school committee members. School committee members are, part of our defense team. Or should I say offense, depending on what day it is and what the issue is. And if the school committee members serve without, and I'm sure they feel, the responsibility and try to do their best, but if in fact they are serving and they don't feel that they have to be accountable to anybody, guess what? You may get a member or two that decides to go rogue in a direction that is not consistent with the outcome objectives that we have, which is excellence, which is equity for all students, not just some. So at the Urban League, I created this formula. When I went to the science and technology school in high school in Springfield, technical high school. Anybody, any tech tigers in the room? Yes, sir. There we go. So we got hooked on, not phonics, we got hooked on formulas in math. So I created this formula. I call it the E3. Equity plus excellence equals empowerment. What is equity? Equity is not a guarantee that you get the prize. Equity is a guarantee that you have a legitimate access to the prize. So you take care of that and you add excellence. Excellence is the effort, it's the intestinal fortitude, it's the sagacity, it's the tenacity, it's the perseverance that drives you to succeed, drives you to go after the prize. And if you put that in, there's a good high percentage possibility that you're going to get the prize, you're going to win, you're going to get that graduate degree, you're going to get that job, that promotion. But you don't even try if you don't have those first two E's in the equation, right? I mean, if you don't have an equal opportunity, then you don't try because you say, hey, you know, I know what they're going to do, the same thing over and over. They're going to hire their relatives, they're going to hire, you know, do whatever. Okay? If you don't have the commitment to excellence, then you don't get the prize. And if you don't get the prize, I mean, if you don't have those two, then you don't feel empowered. The empowerment is a feeling, a belief in yourself, a belief in the idea, the concept that we all can perform at high levels if we put our nose to the grindstone and do the work. We take it in and we embrace the feeling that all students can achieve at high levels. But you got to feel empowered. So remember E3, equity plus excellence equals empowerment. Okay, now say it like you mean it. 1, 2, 3. Go ahead. Give yourself a round of applause. Yeah. Thank you. How's that for filling some time? Let me see, who's next, Len, since we don't have... Travis Ray. I don't need to introduce you again. You got too much attention already. But you can clap for him now. Travis Ray.
So, and can everyone hear me? You turn the mic up. So for the sake of time, now, I'd like to, we'd be remiss if we wouldn't engage with parents. You can't really do it. Parents are not the only stakeholders, but you can't do it without getting into the mindset of parents. So we look to see who's doing that type of work, and when we reached out, we discovered Learning Heroes. And so David Park, who is the Vice President of Strategy and Communications for Learning Heroes based out of Washington, D.C., is going to come up, and he's going to show you some work, some excellent research that they've done in exploring the mindsets of parents. David Park.
So Travis and I both graduated from American University, go Eagles, in Washington, D.C. He graduated maybe a few years behind me, not sure, maybe. All right, so Travis, can you help me find my presentation here real quick?
I absolutely can.
Ah, perfect. That's it. Thank you. All right. Oh, great. Thank you so much. So thank you, Travis, again. Thank you, Henry, Thomas. You both were terrific contributors to the research that I'm about to present. And thanks to all of you here today. It's exciting to see this full room and talk to you a little bit about some important research that we conducted at Learning Heroes about parents and guardians. And so I'd also just real quickly like to thank the 1-8 Foundation, the Barr Foundation here in Massachusetts for supporting the research I'll be discussing today, and also for being so thoughtful and so also intentional about making sure that the research is disseminated and as many people as possible get this critical information so that we can help prepare kids be ready for high school and beyond. So before I get started, let me make sure. There we go. Before I get started, I wanted to give you a little bit of background and context. So Learning Heroes is a relatively new organization. We've been around for about 4 years. And our mission is to inspire and equip parents and guardians to better support their children academically and developmentally. And I was talking yesterday to our friends at Massachusetts Parents United and did a video with them yesterday in Boston, which was a lot of fun. And I mentioned that at Learning Heroes, we've really been humbled by the amount that we have learned over the past 4 years and a few short years that we've been around. And the reason we've learned so much is because intentionally from the very beginning, we decided to talk directly to parents and to listen to parents. And so we invested a lot of time and energy and money to do qualitative and quantitative research so we can hear directly from parents and then develop the types of communications that we know will effectively reach parents and guardians so they can better support their kids. So every once in a while, through the collection of data, there's that one data point that's so profound or so surprising or so compelling that it has the potential to bring about a whole body of work around it. And for us at Learning Heroes, that happened back in 2016 when we first learned that 90% of parents, of K through 8 parents nationwide, think their child is at or above grade level in reading and math. And think about that for a second. 9 out of 10 parents, and this is across race and ethnicity and income level and geography, 9 out of 10 parents think their child is at or above grade level in reading and math. The actual number, if you look at NAEP data, it's about 1/3 of all kids. And when we look at African American and Hispanic kids and low income kids, it's actually that difference is a lot greater than that. And so not only do 9 in 10 parents think that their child is at or above grade level, and they also think 70% or close to 70% think their child is above average academically, and over 60% are confident that their child will go to college and succeed, a 2 or a 4-year college. So these findings have not only shaped our work at Learning Heroes, but they've also helped galvanize a lot of organizations, partner organizations that we work with. And we believe that in order to most effectively support our kids' learning and growth and put pressure on the system to change, and so that it's truly meeting the needs of every child, parents first need an accurate picture of how well their child is doing. So the goals for the Massachusetts research we conducted earlier this year were twofold. One, to establish a shared understanding of Massachusetts parents' mindsets regarding their children's education compared to K through 8 parents nationally, and also to bring together parent and education organizations here in Massachusetts to leverage these research findings and help parents they work with have a more accurate picture of their child's achievement and progress. So these are some of the organizations here in Massachusetts that we worked with. Again, huge thanks to Urban League of Springfield as well as these other organizations that were really critical to this research and offered just tremendous feedback. So going to talk just real briefly about methodology before I dive into the data. So this was an online survey of K through 8 parents in Massachusetts conducted by Edge Research. And Edge also fielded the survey through both landlines and cell phones to increase the possibility for as many people as possible to participate. And so the total sample was 564 parents here in the Commonwealth. We also set quotas so that all data are representative of key demographics, including geography, race, and ethnicity, but we also did oversamples. And so we did oversamples, and what that means is basically in addition to the number of African American and Hispanic and parents who live in Suffolk County and Boston that we would expect from a statewide representative sample, we wanted extra responses so that we could then look at the similarities and differences within each group. And one final point here, just real quick, you'll notice that some of the numbers are in green or red, and some indicate significant, and these indicate significant differences, green higher and red lower, among specific audiences within the Massachusetts survey. And where you see green and red arrows, there are statistically significant differences for Massachusetts parents compared to our 2017 national survey. So a few key insights that we gleaned from the survey. First of all, Massachusetts parents are highly engaged in their child's education. They're incredibly engaged, and I'll go into this in just a little bit. But although they prioritize academics, and they really do, academics are not necessarily keeping them up at night. There are other things that keep parents in Massachusetts up at night rather than academics. In other words, academics are a priority, but not a concern, not a huge concern. And then also, another key insight is that Massachusetts parents, there we go, the Massachusetts parents have a bit more of a realistic view of how well their children are doing academically than parents nationally. I mentioned that disconnect earlier. Well, that disconnect is still there. And it's certainly a pretty big disconnect here in Massachusetts, but it's not as quite as big of a disconnect, and I'll go into this later as well, and that's a very important distinction. So when we factor in that level of engagement of Massachusetts parents, the fact that academics are a priority, and this more realistic view of achievement, it tells us that the landscape in Massachusetts is right for parents to have a more accurate picture of their child's achievement. So let's take a look at the findings. So we'll begin by looking at the response to the question, who is most responsible for your child's success in school? And remember, the blue bar always represents Massachusetts, and the yellow bar represents parents nationally. So here we notice some interesting differences right away. Nationwide, it's pretty even split. So about 40% of parents or so say it's their responsibility, that they have the responsibility for their child's education solely on themselves. And about 40% also say it's the child's responsibility to succeed in school. But in Massachusetts, 50% of parents say it's their responsibility. So parents overwhelmingly in Massachusetts put the responsibility of their child's education squarely on themselves and on their shoulders. This is personal for parents in Massachusetts. And also, parents here in Massachusetts have very high aspirations for their kids. When you ask about college and how important it is for their child to receive a 2 or 4 year college degree, both Massachusetts parents and parents nationwide think it is absolutely or very essential or very important that their child gets a 2 or 4 year degree. But you see that in Massachusetts, we have 78% responding in this way, and these results are very consistent across race, ethnicity, and other groups. So not only is college essential, but Massachusetts parents and parents nationwide are pretty confident that their child will be prepared for success after high school. So 64% of Massachusetts parents are extremely confident or very confident that their child will be prepared for college. And we see some interesting differences here as well. A little more confidence among Boston parents and African American parents, and confidence is also higher among elementary parents than middle school parents. So the students get a little older, there's a little less confidence from their parents that my child is going to be ready for and prepared for college. So this confidence also translates into the likelihood that parents think that their child will graduate from college, if you look at the bar chart to the right. So again, very high numbers. 80% of Massachusetts parents say it's very likely or extremely likely that their child will graduate from a 2 or 4 year colleges. And again, slight differences in audiences here, among audiences. Over half of Boston parents say it's extremely likely their child will graduate with a degree. So we know Massachusetts place the responsibility of their child's education on themselves. They also have incredibly high aspirations for their child, and they're confident about higher education. But what are they worried about when it comes to their child's education? What rises to the top among worries is the concern about how they're going to pay for college. So looking at the graph, we see darker shading representing the Massachusetts parents who worry a lot, and lighter shading represent the Massachusetts parents who worry some, and then the yellow is national. So we add those two top responses, and that tells us we have 72% of Massachusetts parents who report that they worry a lot or some about paying for college, and 57% of parents nationwide feeling similarly. So more parents in Massachusetts are worried about paying for college than parents nationwide. And so second on the list is a child's happiness and emotional well-being. And a lot of times, social and emotional issues, especially with parents, it rises to the top when you're looking at what concerns parents. And that certainly was the case here. This was followed by concerns over their child being bullied, their child's physical safety, and their child safely and responsibly using the internet. Well, one interesting thing here is that the level of worry among Massachusetts parents is higher in 4 out of the 5 items here. So that could be because Massachusetts parents are more worried than parents nationwide, or it could be about when this survey was taken, because this was recently, this was in July, so it was very recently, and there's just a lot of worry in the country, in the nation right now, but it could be because the Parents 2017 was surveyed about a year ago. So here too, there's some differences, interesting differences among parents. Hispanic parents are a bit more worried on several of these items than other parents in Massachusetts. Their top 3 being paying for college, their child being bullied, and their child's happiness and emotional well-being. And among African American parents, 2 of those rise to the top, but they also say their child's physical safety is something they worry quite a lot about. And one thing that you may see that's missing in this list, and this is why we call this the top tier list, is because it's only half the list. It goes on. But one thing that's missing in that top tier is anything to do with academics. And interestingly, academics fall to the second tier in worry among parents, both nationwide and in Massachusetts. So when you look at parents in Massachusetts, there's only one real academic concern that receives over half of parents saying that they are worried a lot or worried some about, and that is their child gaining the knowledge and skills they need for college. Right, there we go. So academics are important. They're certainly important, but they don't rise to the top in terms of some of the other challenges. And if you look at the gray box here, you'll see that 52% of all Massachusetts students are below grade level in math, and 49% are below grade level in reading. So while parents in Massachusetts might have a less inflated view of their child's achievement, it's still not necessarily an accurate view. All right, and so what do parents think are accurate indicators of their child's achievement? So we asked that of parents in Massachusetts, and teacher feedback and report card grades were considered accurate by the vast majority of parents. And state test scores were not considered nearly as accurate, with barely half of parents in Massachusetts considering state test scores as an accurate indicator of their child's achievement. Now you'll see that African American parents and Hispanic parents are more likely to trust the accuracy of state tests, but it still falls way below the other indicators. And what's also interesting here is that while Massachusetts parents don't think they're necessarily the most accurate indicator, they're still looking at the state test results. So 3 out of 4, 75% of parents in the Commonwealth report that they had looked at their child's score reports, compared to 64% nationally. We also asked Massachusetts parents about, let's see, sorry just a second. Make sure I'm in the right place. What they rely on to assess their child's academic achievement. And the things they rely on the most are teacher generated. So they rely on report card grades, parent-teacher conferences, and informal communications with parents. And if you look at the box to the right, which is the percentage of groups who rely on these indicators a lot, you'll see that African American parents are particularly reliant on these teacher-generated indicators. So how do we get parents to have a more accurate picture of their child's achievement? And this is really interesting. One step in the right direction, let me just go here, sorry. One step in the right direction is to just provide them with some simple information. So do you remember that 88% of Massachusetts parents who thought their child was at or above grade level in reading and math? So when we presented them with the statement that you'll see in blue that says recent test scores show that by the 8th grade, 52% of students in Massachusetts were achieving below grade level in math and 49% were achieving below grade level in reading, all of a sudden there was a shift. More than a third of parents who initially said that their child was at or above grade level in both subjects at the start of the survey, all of a sudden say it's somewhat likely that their child may be below grade level when they read that information. So a little bit of information and context really can go a significant way for parents and helping parents better understand how well their children are doing. There we go. And here's some good news. I'm going to end with some good news. As I mentioned at the beginning, Massachusetts parents are highly engaged in their child's education. We asked parents what actions that they had taken in the 2017-2018 school year and found that Massachusetts parents were significantly more likely to engage in these activities than parents nationally. So Massachusetts parents report higher percentages of helping with their child's homework, of attending a parent-teacher conference, and communicating with their child's teacher outside of a parent-teacher conferences. And so we also asked about a lot of things we didn't include in the national survey, things like attending back-to-school nights, reviewing information about their school's performance, talking to the school principal, and accessing a child's grade through an online portal. And Massachusetts parents kind of throughout had very, very high levels of engagement here. And finally, and this I think is really significant, Massachusetts parents are hungry for resources. So remember, I could put those green arrows that show statistically higher than national. They actually would have gone on every single item here because these are all in Massachusetts. They're more hungry for these resources than parents nationally. And that's anything from activities to improve your child's skills in English and math, a detailed explanation of what your child is expected to learn this year, and much, much more information, how to help with your child's homework. These resources parents are really eager to have. And so it's important that we provide these resources in English and Spanish and more languages, since there's so many languages spoken by kids in public school, so that more kids have access to these important resources. So finally, I just wanted to again thank the Urban League here in Springfield, and thanks to all of you. This is my contact information, and bealearninghero.org is our website, and happy to provide you with additional information if you just reach out to me. Thanks so much.
Good job.
Thank you.
When Amazon was looking for a place to locate, they considered a number of factors. One of the major factors was how educated was the labor force. Repeat after me. We are all stakeholders. Gillette. No. That's good. You did good. When Gillette made a decision to come to locate their plant, they ended up where? Anybody know? I'm sorry, GE. Gillette's out of business. GE. Where did they locate? Boston. What did they consider? The education level and the potential for skilled, technical employees. We are all. I want to recognize Mike Tomlin, all the way from the city that they had the name twice. It was so nice. Mike Tomlin from the National Urban League. Where are you? There you are. Okay. Let's give him a round of applause. Mike is a project manager at our national office, and he's a writer extraordinaire. He's worked with Kathy Hughes, who's number one in the industry, in our community, in the entertainment industry, and Oprah, and all kinds of notables within the entertainment as well as education space. So, Mike, we're glad you're here, and hopefully you'll write something nice about us before it's all over. I'm really honored and pleased to have an opportunity to introduce to most and present to some David Osborne. David Osborne directs a project on reinventing America's schools at the Progress Policy Institute. I met him a couple of weeks ago in Denver, Colorado. I guess there was an invitational think tank. I guess it was a day and a half where we were dealing very deeply with these issues, and I couldn't figure out why I was invited, but at any rate, I was there. And I guess I was invited because it was meant for me to meet Dave Osborne. We had to go all the way to Denver to meet because he actually lives in Gloucester, Massachusetts. But he is the author of 6 nonfiction books: Reinventing America's Schools, Creating a 21st Century School System. And that was published September 2017, and I think he has some with him. So I asked him if he would bring a few for sale out there in the lobby. He said, I can only do cash. I said, that's all right. Fantastic Plastic doesn't get it done all the time, so cash is fine. And but at any rate, but he didn't come here to sell books. But when you hear his presentation, you'll probably want it. The price of government, getting the results we need in the age of permanent fiscal crisis. And that was published in 2004. The Reinventor's Field Book, Tools for Transforming Your Government. And then lastly, Brandishing Bureaucracy, the 5 Strategies for Reinventing Government in 1997. Dave has studied the phenomenon of public education deeply and expansively. And he'll talk a little bit about that, but what further got my attention is that he had us in the book. Not us, I'm talking about Springfield. He had the school system, but I'll let him talk about that. And so without further ado, David Osborne, let's hear it for him. There you go, Dave.
Thank you very much, Henry. Good morning. It's great to be here. It was a long drive at rush hour from Gloucester, Massachusetts, but I have to tell you it's a thrill for me to be at the National Basketball Association Hall of Fame because I'm a basketball nut. I played all my life until I got so old it hurt to jump and I had to give it up. I still watch a lot. As Henry said, I've spent the last 5 years or so studying the urban school systems in this country that have improved the fastest to try to figure out what is it that they have done that makes such a huge difference. And published a book about it. And I want to talk about that this morning. But first, I want to start by saying that, you know, we all of us in this room understand that urban school systems in this country have struggled in recent decades. And there's a lot of blame that goes around about that. A lot more heat than light. I want to make it clear, I don't think anybody's at fault. I don't think it's the people in the system. I think, you know, of course, there's a few teachers who probably shouldn't be in front of kids, but 99% of the people who work in our public school systems are dedicated, they're doing their best, they're working hard, they care about the kids, but they are trapped in systems that were designed a century ago. The world has changed, and, you know, our public school systems are trying to change, but it's very difficult and it's slow. And when economic and social realities change in really fundamental ways, the schools and other public institutions and private institutions and nonprofits, they all have to change. They have to adapt to remain effective. You know, it's happened before. Back when we were an agricultural nation, mostly a rural nation, we didn't have a public school system, not like you and I know. We had a bunch of one-room schoolhouses in this country, and some of them were public and some of them were private, and many of them were strange combinations of public and private that we would not recognize today. And then we went through this fundamental change called the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial era came, factories sprung up, millions of immigrants came from Europe, and civic leaders and education leaders and business leaders all realized, wow, we don't have the education system we need to educate these folks, teach them all English, create a workforce that our businesses now need. So they reinvented them. They created the systems that we all grew up with. And at the time, they embraced the cutting edge corporate model. You know what it was called? It was called bureaucracy. This is 100 years ago. Bureaucracy at the time was widely considered the most perfect form of organizational possible. It's what Ford and GM and all the big companies were creating. Centralized, standardized, hierarchical bureaucracies with lots of rules. So that's what we did in education. We created what I call a unified model because everybody worked for one organization. All the teachers, all the nurses, all the aides, all the cafeteria workers, they all worked for one organization, the school district. Very centralized, very hierarchical. The key decisions were made at headquarters, not by the principals and teachers. Students were assigned because, of course, they were walking to school. There weren't any school buses back then. All of them were taught roughly the same thing in roughly the same order, and they kind of marched through by age. That was considered the fairest thing to do at the time. The control mechanism was rules, lots of rules, and every time something went wrong, a new rule. I'll give you an example. One of the most powerful rules in public education is teacher tenure. The fact that if you can last through your first 2 or 3 years, depending on the state, you got a job for life. Where do you think that rule came from? Why do we have that? Anybody know? Yes? Patronage, exactly. Exactly. 100 years ago, in some of our big cities, political machines ran things. And when the Republican machine got control of the school board, they'd fire the Democratic teachers and hire their campaign workers and nieces and nephews. And when the Democratic political machine got a majority, they'd do the opposite. And that was bad for the kids. So tenure was a progressive reform a century ago. Kind of mind-blowing. No one at the time was measuring school performance or teacher performance, and if the schools performed poorly, in other words, if their kids weren't learning, the only consequences were really for the children, not for the adults. So that's kind of how we organize it. That's an abstraction, of course, and were plenty of exceptions. And then in the 60s and 70s, most of our systems unionized, and that put another layer of rules onto the system. And then the world changed. Then the industrial era began to fade, the information age was born, and all kinds of realities changed. The pace of change picked up. We had all these new technologies. The students changed. When I was coming up, 20% of the kids in public education were students of color. 20%. Today it's a majority. So everything changed. And, you know, we went from the industrial era to the information age, from a mostly national market to a global market. And we went from a growing middle class when I was growing up to growing inequality today. When I was in high school, a high school degree was literally a ticket to the middle class. That day is gone. The bar is so much higher. The skill levels people need to thrive in this economy are so much higher. And our districts are struggling to adapt to this, no question, but it's difficult because of the nature of bureaucracy. Bureaucracies are built to be stable. They don't change over time. There's too many rules, too rigid. They're too centralized and hierarchical. You know, if your principals and your teachers feel disempowered, you're never going to get 100% of their efforts. We have a one-size-fits-all. We inherited, it's changing, but we inherited a one-size-fits-all system. You know, the fair thing to do was to educate every child the same way. Well, the reality is kids learn differently. Kids come from different backgrounds. Kids speak different languages. You educate them all the same way, you're being profoundly unfair to about 80% of them. So we need different kinds of schools for different kinds of kids, but that's tough to do in a bureaucracy. We don't have enough choice for today's parents. Parents have become used to lots of choices in their lives, and then, you know, it happened to me. That oldest child, years and years ago, hit kindergarten, and no choice. They're assigned to this school and this teacher, and that's the way it is. Well, people rebel against that. And we didn't have competition in the system. These districts were mostly basically monopolies. The only way you could compete with them is if you charge tuition. So monopolies have a nice luxury. They don't have to change when their customers want something different. So that, it was inevitable, in my view, that our school districts would struggle, and our urban school districts, which have the toughest job by far, would struggle the most. But the good news is that in this country we have a pretty decentralized political system. Most of education decisions are made at the state and local level, and it's given us the room to experiment. And a lot of innovation has sprung up around the country, including Springfield. As Henry said, you've got an empowerment zone partnership here, which is one of the most aggressive district initiatives to change the way public schools are governed and organized in the country, and it's working. I'll talk a little more about it later, but let me just say for now that the stuff I'm talking about takes different forms, and it's possible in a unionized district setting like in Springfield. Now, the places that have gone the fastest have been the places that got to start over. And the famous one is New Orleans. In 2005, they had a storm, Katrina. Basically wiped out most of their public schools. And at the time, they had arguably the worst school system in the country. The performance was abysmal. The finances were abysmal. They were on the edge. When that storm hit, they were trying to borrow money to meet payroll. They were on the edge of bankruptcy, and they were corrupt. After Katrina, 25 district officials, including the chairwoman of the school board, were indicted for corruption. So the state legislature and the governor was a Democrat, elected with lots of votes from New Orleans and a lot of support from teachers' unions. But both Democrats and Republicans in state government were completely fed up. and they basically said, we can't let this district continue. So 2 years before, they created something called the Recovery School District to take over the very worst schools in the state and hand them to charter operators and see if they could do better. And they only about a handful of schools had been taken over at that point. Well, they decided in the fall of 2005, let's take every school in New Orleans that's performing below the state average, let's put it in the Recovery School District. And they passed a bill to do that. Now, the Recovery School District couldn't find, 60 or 70 good charter operators overnight. So the first year they did 6, and they, for the next decade, they did 5 or 6 schools a year. Did a good job, were careful about who got a charter. And, there's some states where they do a lousy job of that, and charters are not very good, but they do a good job in Louisiana. They've closed the ones that failed and replaced them with strong operators. And over the next decade, they've improved faster than any other city in the country. This is data from before they went to the Common Core Aligned test in 2015, where the data changes. But you can see that the top line is the schools that stayed with Orleans Parish. All of them were performing above the state average. Many of them were selective. They selected their students. Okay, that was 17 schools. The blue line is the state average, gradual improvement, about 1% per year. And the green line is the recovery school districts in New Orleans, schools in New Orleans, which improved almost 4 times faster than the state. When they started this, 60% of the school kids in New Orleans went to schools ranked in the bottom 10% of the state. Now it's down to 10%. Half the kids dropped out. By a decade later, they were up to 76% graduation rate, higher than the state rate. Before Katrina, less than 1 in 5 went to college. Now they're above the state average, 61% going to college. So huge improvement. Now people will tell you, I'm sure many of you have heard people disparaging what happened in New Orleans. They'll tell you, oh, it was just demographic change, different kids. Not true. They'll tell you other things. This has been studied left, right, and center. It's real. It's the fastest improving city in the country. It's not perfect, and they're only halfway there. They've gone from an F to a C, and they'll tell you that. They have a lot further to go, but it's working. Now, we don't want natural disasters in every city or any cities, but we've got plenty of systems that are disasters. And Washington, D.C. was another. 20 years ago, it was just like New Orleans, corrupt, terrible, filled with patronage. And at the time, in 1996, Congress created a public charter school board in D.C. And gradually a charter sector grew up. It competed with the district. Finally, after about 10 years, a mayor convinced the city council to give him control of the district. He hired Michelle Rhee, who became famous for coming in and shaking things up and firing a lot of people and getting everyone angry. But that district has embraced profound reform. And so for basically the last decade, you've had 2 systems side by side competed with each other, both improving rapidly. This is the second fastest improving city in the country. You may have read that Chicago's first in the New York Times. That was wrong. If you look at the data, Chicago's probably 3rd, but Washington, D.C. has improved faster. And what's most important, in the poor communities in Washington, D.C., the charters have succeeded far more. They're far more effective than the district schools because the poor district schools don't have the flexibility to do what those kids need. You can't take a kid who's 4 years behind grade level, give them a world-class 6th grade curriculum, and expect them to thrive. And you can't just educate them from 9 to 3. You got to have more time, you've got to meet them where they are, and the charters have the flexibility to do that. Now, I don't have time to tell you the whole DC story or the whole New Orleans story. I wish I did, because they're great stories, but if you want to hear the details, you'll have to get my book. The good and best news is that districts with elected school boards, obviously New Orleans didn't happen because of an elected school board, and DC didn't happen because of an elected school board. But districts with elected school boards have caught on and begun to do some of this same thing. And one of the first was in Denver. Another terrible district back in 2005 when they hired a new superintendent. 39% graduation rate from high school. 39%. I mean, I don't think we've ever seen that low anywhere in Massachusetts. Really struggling. So they hired a non-traditional superintendent. He spent a year looking around, came to the conclusion that it was going to take him a lifetime to change his bureaucracy. But there were a handful of charters, literally 5 or fewer charters in the city that were really knocking the ball out of the park. And he decided that was the horse he wanted to ride. It was the fastest way to improvement. So he went to the charter operators, and to the good ones, and said, we're going to try to equalize the funding. We're going to give you buildings. You replicate as fast as you can, because we need more of you. Now, this district was growing. Denver was growing, so they had room for new schools. So they, over the next decade or so, closed a lot of failing schools and replaced them with new schools, some charters, some not. And then very soon after making that decision about charters, they turned around and said, why can't we give our own schools the same flexibility that's working for the charters? Why keep them tied up in red tape? So they got the state legislature to pass a bill creating innovation schools, allowing them to create innovation schools, which is a district school that has fewer rules. And that was a breath of fresh air, but frankly, giving autonomy to schools is an unnatural act for central bureaucracies. It's very difficult. And a lot of these innovation school principals got very frustrated at being promised, yes, you can buy your own textbooks. Yes, you can manage your own money. Yes, you can hire and fire. And then finding out that they couldn't because the central office in charge of that just didn't do it that way. So some of them got together and said, why don't we try to create some kind of special zone where we'd have even more autonomy? And they came to Springfield, and they learned about your brand new Empowerment Zone partnership, and it inspired them. And a guy named Chris Gabrielli in Boston, who some of you know, who helped create the zone here and chairs the board, went out to Denver and helped them create what they call innovation zones, which have appointed boards. They now have 2 of them. They just passed the 3rd. And the idea is that the schools get even more autonomy. They control even more of the money than the innovation schools. And that board is there to protect them. When the district does try to micromanage them, the board is there to push back. It's an experiment. We don't know how well it's working yet. It seems to be working pretty well. Certainly not bad news. We're getting good news, but it's too early to say. So after a decade of all of this, charters, they're up to, as I put in the slide, about 45% of the kids in either charters or innovation schools. They've had the fastest improvement of any of Colorado's 20 biggest districts. Whereas in 2005, they had the slowest improvement of those 20. Their graduation rates are up, as you can see. Their AP scores are up. Their ACT scores are up. But the thing that's most dramatic is what happened when they went to a Common Core aligned test. They went to the PARCC test, which is the one we started out with in 2015 here in Massachusetts. It's a tougher test. It's more demanding. And in most places around the country, scores went down. Well, in Denver, before the test, their schools were typically between the 15th and 20th percentile statewide. Because, biggest city, most poor kids, most English language learners. Then, when the PARCC came in, they jumped up. Elementary, you can see English and math went into the 40s. Middle school English went into the 50s, above average for the state. This is unheard of for a big, urban, poor city. I don't have middle school math because middle schoolers take about 5 different kinds of math in middle school, so you'd have to break it down by class. But basically in Denver, unlike almost every place else, most of the charters are high schools or middle schools. They've driven the academic growth at that level, and that's why you get the outstanding performance at the middle school level. Again, very unusual for a big city in a state to outperform its state on anything. Other districts are looking at this stuff and saying, well, why don't we take our worst schools and ask charters to operate them? So in Philadelphia and Camden, New Jersey, they call them Renaissance schools. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, Atlanta, San Antonio, they call them partnership schools. There's about 10 districts where this is happening. And other cities are creating zones, somewhat like you've got, and trying to create a nonprofit board that is insulated from politics, that will protect and also hold these schools accountable. My favorite version of this is in Indianapolis, the last example I'm going to give you. In Indianapolis, they got a state law passed allowing them to create what they call innovation network schools. Now, what's different about these is they're nonprofit organizations with their own boards. They have the same autonomy that a charter has, but they're mostly in district buildings, and they're considered district schools for accountability purposes. They have about 20 of them now out of 73 schools. This is their 4th year. 5 of them are existing district schools where the faculty and leadership wanted to convert. They knew they could do better for the kids if they had the autonomy and weren't part of the union anymore. They left the union, they left the district. They get to keep their benefits, their pensions, etc., of course. So 5 schools have converted, and they're probably the best apostles for this approach. Other innovation schools are startups or schools that restarted a failing school. A number of them restarted failing schools, and a few are existing charter schools that realized they could get a better financial deal in a building if they became innovation network schools. So there's 4 different routes. The kids in the innovation schools, higher percentage low income, higher percentage students of color than the district. But as you can see, the fastest improving group of schools in the district. This is the state on the left, the district there, innovation schools in the middle, and this is the percentage of kids passing both English and math in the last 3 years. All charter schools there, and state takeover schools. The state took over 4 or 5 failing schools and handed them to a charter operator. They're also improving, but not quite as fast as the innovation schools. So it's been successful right out of the gate, which is one reason that I think it is so promising. So I call these schools, these models, 21st century models. And what I mean by that, whereas the 20th century model, you had a unified bureaucracy that employed everyone. These are networks of autonomous, accountable public schools, often operated by independent organizations. Not always, but often. The real operating authority is at the school level. They make the decisions about hiring, about firing, about how they use their budget, about the length of school day, school calendar, curriculum, learning model, all of the important stuff. The control mechanism is no longer rules, it's accountability. If they can't deliver, if the kids are falling further behind grade level every year, they get replaced. The school continues, but different team operating. They encourage different kinds of schools for different kinds of kids, because different kids need different environments. So there's Montessori, and there's STEM, and there's classical, and there's hands-on learning, and expeditionary learning. And you go to a place like Washington, D.C., and you look at the charter sector, it's phenomenal, the diversity of school models. Parents, you can't tell a parent you have to send your kid to a Montessori school or a STEM school. So of course they have to have choice. And in these systems, the dollars, when they choose, the public dollars, follow their choice to the school of choice. So the schools have to compete with each other for students and money rather than the old monopoly. That's what I think we're moving toward in urban America. And it works better for obvious reasons. One, the people who run the school actually get to run the school. Can you imagine managing an urban public school and not being able to hire who you want, not being able to fire anyone, having no control over what anybody's paid, not being able to control the length of the school day or year? That's the reality for most urban principals in America. We don't give them the reins. Well, when you give them the reins and you hold them accountable, you get better results, it turns out. Choice is important. Families being able to choose. People who choose are more committed. Plus, as I said, kids need different kinds of environments. Competition is important. And accountability. Actually, if you look at the data closely, without accountability, you don't get the results. And I think the reason is, if you think about it, if you work for a firm or a nonprofit or a public or agency, and you know that everybody in the building has basically got a job forever, as long as they want it, then there's one level of urgency about helping the kids. If you work for an organization where everybody in the building knows that every 5 years you go on trial for your life, and if you're not doing a good job, you all lose your jobs and somebody takes your place, that's a different level of urgency. And it turns out it's also true that successfully educating poor urban kids is really hard. And no matter how wonderful or committed the people who create schools to do that, some of them will fail. It's inevitable. In any of these models, there's a failure rate. If we don't weed out the failures, eventually we get mediocrity. If we do weed out the failures every year and replace them with the strongest operators in the system, or with a new idea that has promise, then performance gets better every year. Now, the bad news is that this accountability doesn't work very well in a traditional district with a traditional elected school committee. Because, I mean, you guys understand it. Turnout in school committee races, as Henry said, it averages about 10%, very low. And you know that a lot of teachers and their spouses turn out and vote. So let's say you're an elected school committee member and you close a school for low performance. Well, you're going to get a protest. And if there's a union, it's going to go system-wide. And they're going to come at you with a candidate the next time you run for re-election. That may or may not happen, but everybody knows it could happen. And it makes elected school committee members understandably shy about upsetting the apple cart. And believe me, closing a school upsets the apple cart. However, if you look at New Orleans or DC or Denver, when they close a charter school, there's sometimes, maybe half the time, there's a protest from that one school building, but the system doesn't protest. All the other operators look at that and say, there's an open building coming. We're ready to replicate. We'd like to help those kids. Maybe we'll try to get that building. So the politics are different, and that's why either the schools being nonprofits, independently operated, or a board, a nonprofit board that's appointed, not elected, over them, as you have here in Springfield for your zone, that makes a difference. It's possible to make that accountability real. So we can listen to the data, and it tells us, if we look at New Orleans, DC, others, we can double the effectiveness of an urban school system in a decade if we embrace this model, this 21st century model. And we can change the lives of tens of thousands of kids. But it is not easy. It takes courage, and it takes political will. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave Osborne. All the way from the Big Easy. for those who are not culturally hip, that's Nollins. Elizabeth Suarez is going to give her presentation, and will you leave some room for questions? Q&A? Okay, good. So this here for Elizabeth Suarez.
Popping this in too. Actually, maybe not. Someone will actually get it. Nope, wrong one. Oops. That one. Oh, never mind. You could have one.
What is it that you need exactly?
Yeah, just was looking for a clicker, but y'all got it.
There we go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I checked my clock. It is, in fact, afternoon now, so good afternoon. My name is Liz Suarez. I work with TNTP. And for those of you in the room who don't know TNTP, we are a national nonprofit, and our goal is to end educational inequality across the district schools and systems that we support. And we do that in 3 primary ways. Number 1, we work directly to help schools and districts find the talent that they need to make sure that schools have teachers in their buildings that are excellent. The second thing that we do is we support engaging academics. We try to help school systems figure out what they need to do to make sure that kids get the right stuff on their desks in front of them every day. And then finally, we work at all levels of every system that we support to try to figure out how to make sure that the environment is as supportive as possible to kids and their families to ensure that they get the education that we all know that they deserve. And my job within TNTP is squarely sits in that academics realm. I started as a teacher 10 years ago in New Orleans, which now you can all flock to me in the lobby and I'll tell you my experience with that big giant flood we had. But my work takes me all over the country, from Miami to Lexington, Kentucky, to Richland Parish, Louisiana, which you've definitely never heard of. I'm positive of it. But what I do is I help school systems, from teachers to principals to district leaders, figure out how to get the right academics in front of their kids. We just released our 6th national report, and it really gets to the heart of the work that I do, which is the work of making sure that kids get access to the academics that they deserve. And this report came to us, like many of our reports, or all of our reports before it, through our work on the ground. So when people like me were getting into schools and buildings, we were noticing across the board that the stuff that was being put in front of kids just didn't seem right. So we wanted to get to understand what was actually happening there. So we decided to ask kids. And these are real kids at the heart of our report. We talked to over 4,000 kids, in fact, across the districts that we worked with. These are kids with very real dreams for themselves. And what we wanted to understand, and the question that we sought to answer, was, if kids show up to school every single day and they do exactly what is asked of them, will they graduate ready to achieve their dreams? Now, we heard from Learning Heroes, which I think was a perfect setup for this, that in fact most of they and their families believe that the answer to that question is yes. And it is not lost on me as we sit here in the Basketball Hall of Fame, which is an institution symbolic of dreams achieved, that that's a promise that we're making to kids. But we wanted to know, is it true? And we were thinking about real kids, kids like Isaac, who wants to be a registered nurse. He's a senior, or he was a junior in high school at the time, and in his own words, he says, I can't give up on this dream that I've had since I was a little boy, and I'm willing to take any chance of my life for this dream. So if Isaac comes and does what he's asked to do, our question is, will he be prepared? And before we even started our research, we knew that the answer to that question in most cases was no. Because while more kids than ever are enrolling in college, kids every year, once they get there, have to enroll in and then pay for remedial courses once they arrive. And we know once they are enrolled in a remedial course, their chances of actually succeeding in college decreases immediately. So we really wanted to get to the heart of why they weren't ready when they graduated from high school, whether it be for college or career. So we partnered with 5 districts across the country. There were 3 large urban districts, 1 rural district, and 1 charter management organization. And we really asked them to just let us get under the hood and experience school from the perspective of a student. So what we did was kind of impressive and crazy, but we observed hours and hours and hours of actual lessons. We analyzed over 5,000 student assignments, and then analyzed over 20,000 pieces of student work. We followed kids, we followed their teachers. We collected over 30,000 in-the-moment surveys from kids about their experience in class. And generally, we just wanted to know what was going on. And what we found were 5 big things. First, we found that overwhelmingly, kids are going to school and doing exactly what it is that they are asked to do. In fact, the first thing was that they have big plans, big goals for college and career. In fact, over 90% of the kids that we talked to either said that they wanted to go to college or said that they wanted a career that would require at least a 4-year degree. And that was across race, that was across socioeconomic status, that was across any of the subgroup status that you can think of. They all had big dreams for themselves. Secondly, most kids are doing what they are asked to do. Third, students spend most of their time in school without access to 4 key resources that I'm really going to spend the rest of our time talking about today. And those are access to grade-appropriate assignments, strong instruction, deep engagement, and teachers with high expectations. And this is particularly true for students of color, students from low-income families, English language learners, and students with mild to moderate disabilities. They have even less access to those 4 key resources. And finally, greater access to those 4 key resources can and does improve student achievement, particularly for students who start the year behind. So the opportunity myth, therefore, is the false promise that if students do what they're asked to do in school, they'll be set up for success, and that if they don't succeed, it must have been something that they did themselves to blow their chances. And that's just not true. And that's on all of us. We've been hearing the word we're all stakeholders now, again and again and again. It's not just on teachers, that's not just on folks who are in the schools, it's not just on district leaders, it's on all of us to make sure to give students a better school experience that sets them up for their dreams and the things that they want to do with their lives. So, let's talk about the actual kids. The kids we studied, like I said, over 90% of them had gigantic dreams for themselves. And these 4 students, including Isaac, who I already mentioned, are the students that will follow through the report today. There's Hajima, who's hoping to be a neurologist. There's Raymond, who's only in 5th grade, but knows he wants to go into the police academy. There is Luz, who's an 11th grader, who's not really sure what she wants to do, but she knows that she wants to do something with kids. And finally, there's Maggie, who knows that she wants to be a trauma nurse. And generally, all of these kids, when they go to school, they're bringing their A game and they're doing their best, and they believe that if they come and they work hard, that they will be successful and be prepared to meet those goals. 88% of the time, they are working on activities that are related to class. 71% of the time, they are meeting the expectations of the assignments that they're given, earning A's, B's, or C's. 83% of the time, they get A's, B's, or C's in English language art, and 78% of the time, they're earning A's, B's, and C's in math. However, even though they are consistently coming and doing their part, they are not consistently getting access to these 4 key things. The first is consistent opportunities to work that is on assignments and on things in class that are appropriate for their grade level. Typically what we see is that kids are consistently working on things that are far below their grade level. The second key resource is strong instruction. So you guys can all imagine yourselves sitting in class. When I say strong instruction, my question is, am I actually doing the math, or am I copying it off the board? Am I listening to someone tell me about a text, or am I reading it and talking to my neighbor about it and having really cool conversations about the implications of it? The third key resource is deep engagement. I might be showing up and doing what I'm asked to do. I might be taking the notes on the page, but am I thinking about it? Is it relevant? Is it enjoyable? Do I find it meaningful? And finally, access to teachers who believe that kids can and will meet the demands of the standards for their grade level. So we're really going to spend the rest of the time that I will be presenting our findings to you talking about these 4 things. So let's start by thinking about grade level assignments first. So kids show up, they do what they're asked to do. 71% of the time, kids are successful on the assignments that they work on. 71% of the time. However, only 17% of the time are they actually meeting the demands of a grade level standard. That 54% gap represents time that kids are spending working on assignments that are below their grade level. So opportunity, therefore, is a scarce resource and one that is not distributed equitably. Because in fact, it wasn't because kids couldn't do those grade level assignments. When they were given the opportunity to, kids, no matter what their race was, were able to, over half were able to be successful on them. There's a small gap between 56 and 65% of kids being successful between white and kids of color, but it's not a significant one. When they worked on assignments that were appropriate, they did well. But the reality is that in classrooms where the majority of the kids were kids of color, 40% of the time, they were never even given the chance. They never got one assignment that was appropriate for their grade. That was only true 12% of the time for kids who were in classrooms that were majority white. So in some classrooms, and this is in an 8th grade classroom in one of the districts that we worked with, kids are getting access to assignments like this. They are asked to read a really high quality book called A Mighty Long Way, and then write an informational essay about what they learned. Along the way, they were asked to talk about it, write about it, think about it, have conversations with their kids. This came from a really high quality curriculum, EL education, which I'm sure some of you in the room are familiar with. In the exact same district, in another 8th grade classroom, kids were working on this assignment, which is a passage called the something Oyster Project. Now I can't remember exactly what it was called, but it's a 5th grade level text. 5th grade. And when they were done reading it, they were asked to answer some multiple choice questions and fill in missing vowels on a word search. These are 8th graders. That's not aligned to any standards, not only for 8th grade, but at all across any grade level. And this was in the same district. In a single school year, the average student spends 530 hours of the approximately 720 hours in their core classrooms on assignments that are not appropriate for their grade. And to be clear, we don't think that the actual answer here is 0. We don't think that kids should be spending all of their time on grade level stuff, but in our research, what we found is that in top quartile classes, so the classrooms that performed the best, kids were working with grade level assignments 50% of the time. That leaves plenty of time for remediation. It leaves plenty of time for kids to do any of the other stuff that they need to do. But in the bottom quartile classrooms, they were only getting access to assignments that were on their grade level 13% of the time. And within that, even in classrooms where they did have grade level content, so only 295 of the 900 that we observed had grade level content. Even when they did, only 74 of those 295 had grade level content and strong instruction, which led to kids feeling really disengaged. And this really changed a lot from elementary school down, from up to high school. So in elementary schools, and this is personal for me, and probably for a lot of you who either work with kids, have your own grandkids, I have a child who is in elementary school right now. They are excited when they get there. They can't wait. They think it's all going to be wonderful. By the time that they're getting to high school, they're only engaged in what they are learning about 25% of the time. So finding it both engaging and meaningful and worthwhile. They're only feeling proud and successful less than 25% of the time. So it's no surprise then that when it comes time for them to think about what they want to do next, they start to feel really doubtful about it all. And in fact, we heard from students in our report, even Raymond, who was a 5th grader, says that he likes math. He thinks it's fun. But when he's in class and tries to speak up and get a chance to talk to his teacher about what he's learning, he gets shut down so frequently that he just puts his head down on his desk. And for Isaac, who has a dream of becoming a registered nurse, he recognizes that most of the time he's copying notes, and he knows that that's not setting him up to do what he wants to do. And this is only made worse by the fact that many teachers don't have high expectations for what kids can actually achieve. So of the teachers that we surveyed, 88% said that they did support the switch to more rigorous standards, but they only believed 44% of the time that their kids were actually capable of meeting those higher standards. This contributes to a mismatch then too between their grades and what they're actually capable of. And I think we heard a little bit about this from the Learning Heroes folks. But basically, kids are bringing home A's, B's, and C's, but they are not ready to be successful by the measure of the tests that they're taking. So either their end of course tests, the ACT, or the AP. So if you look at the AP test, which is the one with the 80% underneath it, of kids who are receiving a B in their AP class, so I'm a parent, I get a B home, I feel great, my kid's ready, they're gonna be fine. 80% of kids who are bringing home a B are not able to pass their AP test at the end of the year. And when you think about kids getting an A, only 50% of them are able to pass the AP test at the end of the year. So we're deeply misleading our students through their grades and their families about what they are ready to do and whether or not they are on track to meet their goals. Again, opportunity is a scarce resource and it's not distributed equitably. But we did see that there was a difference when a student was in a class that was majority students of color and they had a teacher who matched their race or ethnicity. That teacher was 66% more likely to have high expectations for them, as opposed to only 35% of the time if their teacher did not match the ethnicity of the majority of kids in their room. And that really does show up when you think about those grade mismatches. Before I go any further though, I do think it's worth stating, and we've heard this now I think from everyone who's spoken today, that the opportunity myth wasn't created by teachers. Teachers are showing up every day and are working hard. And typically, just like their students, they are doing exactly what they have been asked to do. And the reality is that 93% of the kids that we surveyed said that it is important to their teachers that they learned, and we saw that in our observations. Teachers care deeply about their kids, and teachers feel strongly about their kids learning. But teachers are often not given the tools, resources, and support that they need to figure out how to make sure that the kids that they are teaching get access to the 4 key resources. And those 4 key resources make a big difference. For all kids in our sample, if they had more access to better assignments, they grew 1.7 more months. If they had access to strong instruction, 0.2 more months. 2.5 more months of academic progress when they reported being more engaged, and 4.6 more months of academic progress when their teachers had high expectations for them. When you broke that out by kids who were coming in behind, it was even more staggering. 7.3 more months of academic progress if they had access to better assignments. 6.1 more months with strong instruction, and on and on. And this matters because it flies in the face of the commonly held notion that we have in the education community that if a kid is coming in behind, we have to give them something that meets them at their lower level. What we found is that when they were given access to stuff that was appropriate for their grade level, they flourished. Unfortunately, inequitable access to the 4 key resources isn't random at all. White students and students from higher income families were more likely to be in classrooms that offered the 4 key resources. Students of color and students from low income backgrounds were about 25% less likely to receive grade appropriate assignments, and they also received less than half of the amount of high quality lessons. Now you're gonna see the words more on this slide a lot. And that really just has to do with the fact that if you're white or come from a high income background, you are much more likely to get access to these 4 key resources. Again, opportunity is a scarce resource and it is not distributed equitably. It comes out in a big way then too when you look at the way that grades are distributed. We saw a lower grading standard for students of color, resulting in even more misleading signals about their readiness to achieve their goals. So if you look at that same statistic about AP tests, which is on the left side of the screen now, I told you that 80% of B students were not able to pass their AP, and 50% of students getting A's were not able to pass their AP. When you broke that up by students of color versus their white peers, you see that 80% of students who are white who are earning an A actually are able to pass their AP, while only around 30% of students of color earning an A in their AP class actually being able to pass that AP test. There is some hope here. It's not all doom and gloom. What we saw is that students are able to achieve much more, even with just a modest increase in one of the 4 key resources. In fact, what we saw is that students of color could actually catch up to state averages and to their peers in 5 years if they sustained the gains that we saw in classrooms where at least 25% of assignments were grade appropriate. That's 25%, 1/4 of assignments being grade level appropriate. The achievement gap would be gone in 5 years, which means that it's not inevitable at all. It is baked into a system where some kids are getting access to resources and others are not. So it's fixable, it's solvable, but it's gonna take every single one of us, not just those of us who work in schools or districts or at nonprofits, all of us working together in partnership to fix this, which is why I'm so honored that I was asked to come today to talk to you guys about it. So before we go any further, I just want to pause. You guys have been sitting for a very long time, and I just threw a whole lot at you. Take a minute. If you don't know the person that you're sitting next to, just introduce yourself and tell them one thing that you are thinking about right now in terms of what you're taking away and what you're going to take to your work and your community when you leave here. Go ahead and talk. The first thing that we are asking people to commit to, and this goes for everybody, not just, I'm trying to be aware of the fact that you keep moving this, I'm sorry. We're asking everybody to commit to 2 things. First, every student should have access to grade appropriate assignments, strong instruction, deep engagement, and teachers with high expectations every day in every class, regardless of their race. Again now, this is not a checklist. It is not meant to be the end-all be-all, but here are 5 things that we are thinking about. First, ask students and their families about their goals for themselves. Know what they are. Know what they want to achieve. Too often in education, we placate families. We have an event and we say we've done our community outreach. We need to do more. We need to understand what it does. So please do find me if that's something that you're interested in exploring. But without further ado, I want to get back to this piece around hearing from students and families in the community, ethnicity, or any other part of their identity. We will continually investigate the extent to which our students receive this access and report on their progress. The other thing we think is incredibly important is that every student and family is an authentic partner in this work. For too long, we've tried to fix education with a bunch of educators. And don't get me wrong, I'm an educator. I love educators. But we have to branch out. It's not gonna work with just us.
Well, stakeholders.
Stakeholders, yes, let's all repeat it again. Stakeholders. Oh, you're not going to do it for me. You guys did it so well. Let's try that again. Stakeholders. Stakeholders. Thank you. So an authentic partner, every family is an authentic partner and should have real opportunities to shape the experiences that students have in school, receive accurate and accessible information about their child's progress, and have legitimate role in decision making. We will continually seek feedback from all students and families about whether or not we are living up to that commitment. And in just a moment, we're going to live up to that by hearing from some students here today. I didn't want to leave you hanging though. Typically in our reports, we do offer some recommendations, and we have students and families need and want and what their goals are. Secondly, make access to grade-appropriate assignments an urgent priority for all students, no matter their race, their income level, their status as English language learners, special education, doesn't matter. They all can and deserve access to grade-appropriate stuff. Third, give all students, especially those who are behind, access to instruction that allows them to engage deeply in meaningful content. Ensure educators enact high expectations for student success by seeing firsthand that students are capable of succeeding with the material. And finally, conduct an equity audit to identify school and district level decisions from the diversity of staff at all levels, so which students are enrolled in honors courses that give some students greater access to the key resources than others. The equity audit is actually something that needs to be, and I'm going to pass it over.
Thanks, Travis. Thank you very much for your insight. I understand I stand before you in lunch. That concludes my remarks. I want to thank Henry and the Urban League and John Davis Foundation. I want to thank each and every one of you. Because of your efforts, we're proving that a zip code is not going to dictate the future of our children. And moving forward now, as a young lady indicated, it's a family affair. And I'm very proud of the gains we've made under Superintendent Dan Lohr with our school system, reaching now nearly 80% in graduation, dropping out the dropout rate in half. Being very creative, being looked upon across the country now with the empowerment zone that we're doing, what we do well in our public system with the flexibility of the charter, and working with our business community and working with our teachers. I do firmly believe that our young people and the majority of families, 9 out of 10 or 99%, do and want and expect to succeed. And we have to make sure that we continue to give them the foundation. We are starting with more and more early childhood opportunities in our public school system and our private sectors that we're working with. Getting to our families at a young age with wraparound services to make them all aware that you can and you will achieve, whether you go on to college or technical or a career or military. But we've made a lot of strides. There's much more to be done, but it is a partnership. It is a partnership. And I thank each and every one of you for your continued belief and investment in the city of Springfield, but especially our children. Last thing I'll say, did Henry give you his 3 E's? Yeah. He did. With that, I'm out. Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy Hanukkah. Enjoy your meeting.
Thank you so much, Mayor. So I'd like to also point out that we're also joined by the president of Springfield Technical Community College, Dr. John Cook. And it's fitting because we have 2 students with us from STCC. I'd like to bring forward, just for 2 minutes, Olivia Bodie and Carolyn Burgos. And I hope I pronounced the last names properly. And what we wanted to do was just quickly get some perspective, some insight from them on everything that Liz just shared. I mean, we can start by just simply exploring. We're going to ask them to introduce themselves and they should share your experience, your preparation in high school, and making your way into college. What was it like? What are your dreams? What are your aspirations? And are we helping you live up to those?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Carolyn Burgos. I study business at STCC, and I am also proudly the student trustee on the board for STCC. you want her to introduce herself? I'm sorry, go on.
Hello, everyone. My name is Olivia Boati, and I'm also at SDCC studying liberal arts. And I am the treasurer on the.
All right, so I guess looking back at my educational experience, my family and I came here 10 years ago. I came here when I was 9, I'm 19 now. And as soon as we got here, it was a feeling of isolation. I was bullied. Obviously, my English skills were not up to par. I was also almost brought back a grade to, improve on my skills, but thankfully that didn't happen. So the first school the elementary school that I was put into, I was supposed to have a teacher going with me to every class and helping me and learning. And I found myself a lot of the time sitting in that class, not knowing what was going on. The teacher was not helping me, she wasn't translating, or she wasn't there with me. So in turn, I was then changed to a different school where I got amazing help, and the teacher was greatly helpful with me. She got textbooks for me, she sat down with me about an hour every day to learn. And of course, I was put in the ESOL courses up until my sophomore year of high school. Now, when I was, I think it was like 6th or 7th grade, I was already proficient with my English skills. However, I was still put in ESOL classes up until my sophomore year of high school. Meanwhile, I was taking an honors English course. So that, in my mind, did not make any sense at all, and I'm sure it does not. So I will let Olivia start with her story before we go in a little deeper.
So just like Carolyn, I also moved here almost 10 years ago. We have a very similar life story. I was fortunate enough to live in Italy where I had a different experience. And then I moved there when I was about 9 from Ghana. And it was it was a cultural shock. They're above and like learning, and it was just like, whoa, kind of moment. But fortunately for me there, I had a teacher with me who would follow me around, and that helped me a lot. I grasped the language better just because I guess I was younger, so I was able to learn it faster. And then my family relocated here, and it was like, whoa. I was just thrown into a class, no kind of English skills. It was just struggles over struggles over struggles. I had to basically learn English by myself. I was not tested. I was not asked about whether or not I knew what I was doing. So basically, I was placed into a class, and then it was in 7th grade. Moving into 8th grade, I was able to take a test finally, and then that made the teachers know where to place me. And so I started receiving the help that I needed to further my education.
All right, so I guess diving into the high school experience, I did have experiences where teachers were not very engaging. The lessons were not very engaging at all. I've had a math course where the teacher used to tell us the pages in the textbook where we should go to and give us a packet, and I was like, it. She's like, here, do it. And she sat at her desk like the whole class. So since then, I've been, like, math is one of my hardest subjects. And I think it begins from there. It begins from the educators, because I've never really gotten like a real good math course that was really engaging, that really got me passionate about it. And when I went into college, I have had to take remedial courses to get me to keep going ahead. And even then, it's really hard to find a mentorship in the teachers that we engage with, and to really be engaged with school like at all. And also, I always make a point about history classes and what we learn in there, and where we really kind of continue to lose our identities, because we are not taught about our Latin or Black contributions, our heroes, people that we can relate to and look up to. So I've always thought that was really important and really affects a child's education, while also needing well-equipped and effective teachers.
Definitely. In high school, I was fortunate enough I applied for a TRIO program on camp in my school, and it was the Upward Bound. And I went through the Upward Bound program, and I always say that I'm so thankful for that program because I literally did not know how to apply to college. I didn't know what I was doing, but they had 6 weeks where we would go, and basically it was just a college experience. We took hard classes. They exposed us to like the college experience, and that really prepared a lot of us to get into the college mindset. And then during the school year, they helped us apply to colleges, anything that we needed, gave us the information, and they also reached out to our families and spoke with our families. And so that's something that helped me. Going back to classes though, it was always a struggle. And even STCC, I took an African American course, and what I found was I think he was one of the first black professors that I had actually seen on campus. And that alone was like, I was so proud to be black. Like, I've always been so proud, but seeing him was like a wake-up shock for me. And unfortunately, he moved. And one of my classmates, his name was Tyrone, and we were in the same course together, and when he found out that the professor was leaving a black African American male, that was really discouraging for him, and he's no longer on campus. So I think having professors that look like us is always encouraging to students, and it helps.
I promise I wouldn't. Can everyone hear me? My microphone's not too loud. So for the sake of time, I mean, I can't say enough about what you just shared. I mean, it speaks to the evidence that was just presented to us. And we're truly grateful for you taking the time out of your schedules to come and share with us so that we could really hear and your experience will resonate. And given the fact that you're in front of a part of this body of stakeholders, we all are stakeholders. Given the fact that you're a part of this body and you know that we now know your story, you hear the research, you've seen it for yourself, do you feel optimistic about your future prospects?
I definitely feel optimistic about my future prospects. I think, and I'm grateful for all the work being done towards this, because a lot of the times we find people who do not want to have these conversations, and these are the conversations that matter the most. The kids need this. They literally do. Not too long ago, I also had the opportunity to speak at South End Middle School, and just looking around, I had this urge, and I stood up in front of them, and I had to tell them, like, society needs you to try. Your parents, the world, we need you to try. We need you to put in your best. And I had this overwhelming feeling where I just like had to say something to them to push them forward, because maybe they don't get this all of the time. I mean, we're talking about a minority majority school and just the environment of the school. So it's definitely very important for them to also be educated about everything that's being done for them, that they matter and people care about them.
It makes me optimistic as well, because just looking at my younger sister, it makes me hopeful. It makes me happy that maybe before she gets to college, she'll not have to go through the same experiences that I did, and that she'll be able to grasp education and actually learn in class and not just be spat at with information throughout the whole entirety of it.
Thank you so much. Thanks again to Dr. Cook, SDCC, and special thanks to Lydia Rivera-Early, SDC's Workforce Development Specialist. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right, so now we're really getting the conversation started, excuse me, and I have the pleasure of introducing my colleague, Natasha Yashiminsky. I'm pronouncing it right all these years, if you think I'll get it right. But anyway, I think what's helpful of Natasha's presentation is this is when we're really going to start talking about what's happening here in Massachusetts. You've heard about the report, number one for some, and she was one of the leads from Ed Trust that worked with our partners here in Massachusetts to find out, to get a serious landscape of what's happening in Massachusetts, where are the highlights, why it's number one, why it's only number one for some, and then also really pointing to some areas that we can all work together, that we're all stakeholders, and that we can work together to address the disparities that we see in the system here in Massachusetts. So I'm going to get off the stage and get out of the way so Natasha can get started.
I love it when technology works. Let's see if it's going to keep working for me. All right. Great. Okay. So at the beginning of this convening, you heard from the president and CEO of the Education Trust, Dr. John King. And as he said, we at Ed Trust are really proud to stand alongside civil rights and education advocates from across the state of Massachusetts in the Massachusetts Education Equity Partnership. These groups really got together because they wanted to highlight the true story of opportunity and achievement in the state, which frankly varies quite a lot right now by students, race, and socioeconomic background. I want to thank Liz, and I want to thank both of the students who were up here just a few minutes ago for sharing their stories. And what I want to do is share with you some of the data that I think highlight those same stories, but a little bit more sort of high level for the state of Massachusetts. You know, we do a lot of celebrating in the state. This year we celebrated the 25th anniversary of the Massachusetts Education Reform Act. And the reality is there is actually quite a lot to celebrate when it comes to our education system. The Commonwealth has long been a leader when it comes to education, and it's made really big gains in recent years, and we should acknowledge that. In fact, kind of when you look at statistics nationally, Massachusetts is widely acknowledged as the #1 state. We hear this a lot, right? #1 in the state in reading and math on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, #1 in advanced placement success, #1 in the world, actually, in reading on a worldwide assessment. But as we celebrate that success, we also have to reflect honestly on the things that we haven't accomplished yet. Because the reality is that underneath those high rankings are pretty glaring and pretty persistent inequities that separate lots of our low-income students and students of color from their peers. Consider that National Assessment of Educational Progress on which Massachusetts ranks #1. In 2017, on that assessment, our schools got less than 30% of Black and Latino students to grade level in 4th grade reading. That's way lower than the rate at which they were getting their white students to grade level reading. In 8th grade math, our schools got only about 28% of low-income students to grade level. That's half the rate for higher income students in our state. In fact, when we compare scores from across the country, the level of education that Black and Latino students receive in Massachusetts is more similar to the average student performance in some of the lowest performing states nationwide than it is to the performance of their more privileged peers in the state of Massachusetts. Graduation rates in our state, especially for low-income students and for students of color, they're not just lower than the rates of their more privileged peers in Massachusetts. They're lower than graduation rates for similar students in other states. So for example, our graduation rate for Latino students is about 73%. That places the state 43rd in the country for graduation rates for Latino students. And although more students do graduate in 5 years than in 4, frankly, too many are not graduating at all. In the class of 2016, about 1 out of every 11 low-income students dropped out of high school entirely. When we look at college readiness rates, whether students are prepared to succeed in college-level courses based on the SAT, we see that less than a third of Black and Latino students in Massachusetts who take the test, and not everyone does, but of those who do, only a third score at that college-ready level in reading and math. Too many of our graduates don't go to college at all. And of those that do, far too many have to take those remedial classes in higher education, classes that cost money but don't earn them credit toward graduation. I just shared some data that were statewide. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into kind of this area of Massachusetts, looking specifically at Franklin, Hampton, and Hampshire counties. And here too, we see lots of the same trends that we see across the state. On this chart, every dot represents a district in these 3 countries. And dots that appear to the right, I'm sorry, I'm gonna turn myself around. From your perspective, dots that appear to the right have higher percentages of students from low-income families, and dots that are higher up are those that have higher scores on average, districts that have higher scores on the Massachusetts State Assessment. What you see is a clear trend. The districts with more low-income students on average demonstrate lower performance. Right? This is again a trend that we see across the state. Another trend that we see across the state too, but that's really important to remember, is we don't see these disparities just between districts. We see them within districts too. So many school districts in this area are demonstrating lower results for their Black students than for their white peers, with some of those gaps being really large. The same is true when we look at outcomes and disparities in outcomes for Latino and white students. Now, disparities in student outcomes are the direct result in disparities in opportunity to learn. We just heard from Liz about some of the most critical of those disparities in kind of differences in student experiences in school. I'm going to show you some data on some of the kind of broad disparities in opportunity to learn in Massachusetts. Importantly, those disparities are not just all within the school system, right? We know that outside of school factors matter too. We know that 30% of Black children, 36% of Latino children in Massachusetts grow up in poverty. 40% of students in Massachusetts have experienced trauma. In 2016-2017, over 20,000 students in the state were homeless. These are terrible numbers, and we need to do much better as a state for our students and for our families. But the reality is that educational inequities are also pervasive within the school system, and we have to sort of own that and address those as well. Oftentimes when we think about disparities and opportunity to learn, one of the first things we think about is money. Totally reasonable. In Massachusetts in 2015, high poverty districts received about the same amount in state and local funding per student as the wealthiest districts. Now, that may not look terrible, but first of all, note that that is way less progressive than a lot of other states in the country. And secondly, we all know that equal is not the same as equitable. We have to be honest about the fact that the needs of students in some districts are higher than in others, and we need to be providing the resources to help schools and educators meet the needs of all students. Moreover, money is just one of the many inequities that students face within our education system. In Massachusetts, Latino and low-income students in particular are less likely to have access to early learning opportunities. And then once they get into the school system, they're denied all sorts of critical resources that students need to be successful. Black and Latino students in the state are 3 times more likely to be assigned to a teacher who lacks content expertise in the subject they teach than their white peers. And importantly, Black and Latino students in the state are less likely than their white peers to encounter a teacher who looks like them, not just in their classroom, but in their school. That's because while about 40% of our students are students of color, only 8% of our educators are people of color. Students of color and low-income students, as well as students with disabilities and English learners, are also less likely to have access to the full range of classes that the state of Massachusetts recommends for college readiness. Nearly 4 out of 5 graduates in the state complete what's called the Mass Core curriculum, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but there are far lower results for Black students, only 64% of whom complete this curriculum. And when we think about the things that our students of color get more of, one thing they get quote unquote more of is harsh and exclusionary discipline. Because despite some improvement, Black and Latino students in Massachusetts are 3 times more likely to be suspended out of school in our schools today than their white peers. These inequities matter. They matter a ton to individual students, right? Because education level in Massachusetts is directly related to income level in the future. They matter to our economy as a whole, because the fewer adults with college degrees in our largest cities we have, the higher the unemployment rates tend to be. And they matter to our democracy. These are not Massachusetts-specific data, but I think we're all quite aware of the implications of the 2016 elections. And only about a third of registered voters with less than a high school degree cast a ballot that year, as compared to about 2/3 of individuals with some college education. They also matter because the demographics of Massachusetts, as other folks have mentioned, are changing. Even some 24 years ago, only about 20% of students enrolled in our schools were students of color. Today, students of color account for 40% of the student body. So it is really not an understatement to say that the future of the Commonwealth really rests on how we choose to serve our state's low-income students and students of color today. The bottom line is there is no excellence without equity. And if our state really wants to be number one, then the next phase of educational improvement has to focus on confronting and addressing these inequities. But thank you for your time. To learn more, please grab a copy of the report, Number One for Some. There are some copies available there. They're also available at numberoneforsome.org. Thank you.
Yes. Is President Christine Royal still in the house? President of Holyoke Community College? I guess she already left. I had a text saying that she was in the house. Technology, I tell you, can't beat it. I am so pleased to introduce to you a gentleman who I've known for a while. In fact, he is the former Secretary of Education for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. He is a Harvard Law professor. He's a Francis Keppel Professor of Practice in Education Policy and Administration. And he's also the founder of the school redesign program that he is taking on a national model implementation to learn as much as we can as to how do we serve our students in a holistic context rather than in a singular context. So I'm talking about none other than Paul Revel, Dr. Paul Revel. Secretary. Philip is next. Hey, how you doing?
Thank you very much, Henry, and thank you all for turning out to talk about such an important topic. I'm thrilled to be here and honored to be on the program with the likes of John King, who spoke earlier, who's one of my heroes in this field. And only for Henry would I come out after a 3-hour class when I have to return to chair an event at a few hours coming forward. I've long been an admirer of the work Henry has done out here. I see my second grade classmate, John Davis, in the audience, and he's been a huge leader. I'm a Western Mass guy, for those of you who don't know. So I'm thrilled to be here on a topic that really is at the center of my life and the work that I do, and I appreciate the presentations from Natasha and from Liz and others that have preceded me, and I'm sorry because of my other commitments that I wasn't able to be with you earlier. So I think I'm toward the end of the program here, and 2 more after me. But what I want to do is really look forward, because I think you've had a pretty dramatic call to action. I thought that last presentation was very succinct and very clear, and sums up in a vivid way something that many of us have been talking about for a long time, which is doing well isn't good enough. We're living in a Commonwealth where, like the rest of the country, there's an iron law correlation between socioeconomic status and educational attainment and achievement, is not living into the American dream, into the ideal of equity and excellence for all. We've done well, we've got a lot to celebrate, but we've still fallen way short of what our objective was in the education reform work that I had the honor to be part of, that started in the early 1990s. And the goal was to prepare all children to be successful. All means all, no excuses, no exceptions. By that standard, we failed, notwithstanding all these accolades and first place finishes that are based on averages that we've seen. So we know that, and we've known that for some while. And the question really now becomes, what are we going to do about it? How do we mobilize? And I've heard a number of suggestions, and I was thrilled that you had the students in front of you. And I think we'd be foolish to ignore the guidance that they gave us about what's important to them and what they need to see and be able to do in their schools and their environments. So that's important to have them as part of the conversation. But what do we need right now? Well, I contend that we're in, number one, a somewhat dire predicament in the field of public education right at the moment for a variety of reasons. If you think back even as recently as the presidential campaign of 2016, both parties are more or less tongue-tied on the subject of education. Neither of them has been willing to sort of front and center address some of the critical issues in the field because we've had such controversies among ourselves within the field of education. Unlike when we started education reform in the 1990s, and when there was a fair amount of consensus about what needed to happen in education. If we wanted equity, we were going to have to set a standard by which to measure whether or not our systems were fair or excellent. We'd have to measure progress occasionally. We'd have to hold folks accountable. We'd have to inject data into a system that didn't pay much attention to data on performance. We'd have to focus on teaching and the quality of teachers and the work that they do in classrooms. We'd have to deal with chronic underperformance. There was a fair amount of consensus within our education field and within the larger community that surrounds us that these were common sense things to do. And we did them. And in Massachusetts, we did them vigorously and expensively. But the progress has been relatively modest. When you look at the averages, particularly when you look at the averages nationwide, the progress has been relatively modest. And at the same time, the controversies have been bitter and divisive within our field. For example, the controversies over charter schools, the controversies over testing, controversies over the Common Core standards, the controversies over how we evaluate teachers. All of these have driven many allies away from our field. It used to be that governors were competing with one another for the mantle of education governor, and business people wanted to be known as the business CEOs. Now, most of those folks, frankly, have scattered to the winds because the space is too dangerous, too divisive to get involved in. And furthermore, you can't be certain there's going to be any progress because the results have been modest. So that leaves us with a dilemma. We're slightly abandoned as a field. Now, some people like this. They say, leave us alone and give us more money. Just trust us. We'll do the best we can. We care about kids. That's not a winning message. That's not going to get us the attention or the support we need as a field to move forward. What is going to get attention, what is going to get people focused is the kind of message that you've been hearing today, which is our future, the future of our economy, the future of our democracy is intimately connected with the future of our children. We can't be successful in cities like Springfield or Worcester or Fall River or Boston or Lawrence or Lowell or New Bedford. We can't be successful unless our children are successful. And helping our children to be successful means preparing them to be part of a 21st century high-skill, high-knowledge democracy and preparing them to be active, informed citizens and leaders in a complex democracy. To the degree that we achieve that, we will be able to prosper and have a promising future as a society. To the degree that we fail to do that, we're at a loss. We're going down. And right now, the signs aren't very good. People aren't paying much attention at the federal level. Most of our states are distracted. We're lacking a vision. We're lacking real leadership on education and where we go from here. And my conviction is that really where this is going to happen most prominently, and what I find most helpful going around the country and working with the cities that we work with, we have 25 cities in visiting us this week at Harvard, talking about work that they're doing through collaborative action on dealing with just the set of issues that you're talking about this morning, is at the local level. I think this is where we care the most, where we're most intimately connected with the children, and where we have the sort of best capacity to overcome the differences that divide us and figure out how to come to a common table and set a common agenda and make education and child development work in our communities. And that vision has got to encompass something more than just improving education. I'm a big believer in improving education. God knows we spend a fortune on public schools. We have to do better with the money that we spent on schools. And there are a lot of ways, and you've been talking about them today, in which we can do better. But I think a proposition that we've proved over decades, but let's just say over the course of the past 25 years of school reform, is that schools alone, as currently constituted, remember that schools constitute about 20% of a child's waking hours between kindergarten and grade 12. Schools alone, as currently constituted, have proved themselves, on average, inadequate to preparing all children for success. So the solutions are going to be community solutions. We're going to have to look at the sun here. We're going to have to look at the issue of poverty and its impact on how children show up at school, or if they show up at all. And what can we as communities do to create systems of opportunity and support that wrap around children, that wrap around families, that wrap around schools, that meet each and every child where they are in early childhood and give them what they need inside and outside of school in order to enable them to become successful and to move along their trajectory through education to emerge with some post-secondary credential, ready for high-skill, high-knowledge employment, ready for full citizenship, ready for family leadership, ready to become lifelong learners. It's going to take whole communities coming together to do this job. If we continue to push it onto the schools and say, you give us a shortcut to equity, you give us a shortcut to opportunity, it's beyond their capacity. They're working as hard as they can to do what they've been charged with and held accountable for. So all of us have to find a way to get involved, which means everybody has to come to the table, which means we've got to get a lot better at listening to one another, at tolerating diversity, embracing diversity, and by this I don't just mean ethnic and racial diversity, but I mean ideological diversity, different people with different ideas. Most of us agree at a top level on what we want to accomplish for children, but when we get to the level of how we accomplish it, that's where we have our bitter fights. That's where we go after one another, and that's where we destroy the sector and make it unattractive to others to come in and work with us. We've got to correct for that. We don't need orthodoxy at this stage of the development of what we need to do for children and how to achieve equity in our society. We need collaboration. We don't need perfect consensus. You're not always going to get exactly what you want to have happen done, but we need people coming together and having the hard conversation about what's important to do and what's the most feasible, reasonable way to approach doing that. And I think in the near term, that's the sort of spirit we need. If you look at us here in Massachusetts, I'd say we're stalled. We don't have a clear, prominent vision on what to do next. I think we have a growing awareness that what we've done thus far was necessary but totally insufficient to what we wanted to achieve. But now we need to have a tougher conversation, particularly in light of all the reservations and pushback on some of the reforms that have happened recently, about, okay, if not these things, then what do we need to do next, and how are we going to come together to make it happen? And that's a lot easier said than done, I know, but it means pointing toward the future. And right now, frankly, we're not getting it from leadership statewide. And it's not necessarily a fault of leadership. Leadership is distracted at the state level. There are enormous problems that people are coping with, from transportation to budget, even within the education sphere, to the questions of money and school finance, which are hugely important, but it would be a mistake to think that this is all about money. Money doesn't equal equity. Money doesn't equal success. It's what you do with the money that matters. And so that's what we need to be thinking about. If we can get the resources we need, how do we do our utmost to improve not only what goes on in the schoolhouse, but what wraps around the schoolhouse, the lives of children. People mentioned trauma earlier. The opportunities that those of us who have privilege are routinely able to give to our children, but those who don't happen to get that through the lottery of birth, they don't have those opportunities, and that's 80% of their lives outside of school. We just happen to measure the results in school and hold schools accountable for the total product, even though they only have contact in 20% of the time. So to take that into account is broad, it's ambiguous, progress will be slow, but it's critically important, and you know how to do it in places like this with the kind of community leadership you have and the kind of faces that I see in this audience coming together, is to create what in effect amounts to a new social compact of what we as a community commit ourselves to for our future, what we commit ourselves to doing for our children and families in exchange for their effort to make this society, to make this democracy, to make this economy work. And that compact has to be bigger and better than just a quality school system. That's a minimum. That's a fair standard and a fair expectation. But it needs to go beyond that and start in early childhood and extend to after school and summers and all kinds of supports in the health and mental health area. And the kinds of things, again, that those of us who have privilege take for granted, and therefore our children enjoy all the advantages that go along with that. And if we really want to get to all means all, we have to build a system that provides that kind of support and opportunity for everybody. So that, I hope, is the focus of future conversations as we move forward. With that, I know you've got other speakers, so I will stop, Henry, but thank you for inviting me.
All right, well, boy, are you guys in for a treat, let me tell you. All right, so I'll go through this as quickly as possible, and we'll be happy to take any questions afterwards. So I'm going to talk about some national trends. I'm going to talk about the relatively new federal law that hopefully folks here in Massachusetts, and more specifically in Springfield, can use to bring about greater equity for the students. Years ago marked the birth of the pumpkin spice latte. Happy holidays. What that means is that policies that are being set up now and that are beginning to be implemented will probably supposed to incorporate the performance of historically underserved students, so you get an accurate picture of not just the all students, but of the students that have been historically underserved in the system. And then states are also supposed to identify at least 3 categories of low-performing schools so that those students who need help can get it. Pushback against accountability in schools, largely because it's based on tests. And with the new law and Massachusetts' policy, the accountability system is based on more than just test scores. They're based on test scores, but also improvement in those test scores, graduation rates. In Massachusetts, you have something called an extended engagement rate, dropout rates, the percentage of kids getting advanced coursework, chronic absenteeism. So there's a lot more going into the system than just test scores. Your ratings are going to be changed. talk to the State Department of Education about. There's funding available from the federal law that you can use to provide greater access to advanced coursework. School districts have access to over some of those dollars to go to create better alignment between high school and K-12. We have some additional resources. I'd be happy to field them. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you again, Phil. Again, I'd like to now welcome up Liz Ross, who I mentioned as the author on the ESSA School Improvement Promise to Practice peer review. Take it away.
So we'll run right off of here, so you can't use the clicker, you have to use this.
Use that? Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you everyone for staying through the end. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and tell you about the work that we have been doing over the past year. So I am the Director of K-12 State Policy at HCM Strategists. We are a policy and advocacy consulting firm based in DC. We have been partnering with the Collaborative for Student Success for over 5 years, working on issues related to standards, assessments, accountability, and the mission of HCM is really, we are a mission-driven firm, and so we really believe in advancing the voice of students and patients and advancing opportunities. We, this year, in our partnership with the Collaborative, launched an initiative called Promise to Practice, where we are looking at how states are addressing the needs of their lowest performing schools. So as Philip mentioned, every state has an accountability system. He walked you through Massachusetts. Once you get your rating and you have been identified as needing support and improvement, used one of 4 prescriptive categories as defined under in law. That went away, and so now with this significantly more flexibility and autonomy and authority, districts can now create a strategy that they believe deems best to fit their school context and needs. In addition to this, states also act as the gatekeeper of federal funding. So they now take over that role of monitoring and oversight, and they have the ability under the law to determine how that money is allocated, to what extent the strategies that a school or district might choose is aligned to a state's vision for improvement, the extent to which evidence-based practices are evident within the implementation plan. So states now have more responsibility in terms of what school improvement strategies they are going to fund and what that will look like. And so with this in mind, we and the Collaborative wanted to know, given this new change and this new shift, we developed 3 questions that we really set out to answer through our review. And those 3 questions are, how are states utilizing their autonomy to implement comprehensive and effective approaches to intervene in those low-performing schools? What are the best practices that are emerging across the country? This is the first year of implementation, and so we know that as states are getting used to this new flexibility, and given the elections, who is really flexing their muscles, who is not, What are some of those trends that are emerging? We know that there's a lot of questions that states have and districts have in terms of what works. The research is mixed at best, and so what does this look like? So we're trying to identify those best practices as well as generally what's the progress that states are making thus far in implementing their school improvement provisions under ESSA. So to answer these three questions, we convened a bipartisan and diverse group of peers. They represented individuals who were former state superintendents, who were state board of education leaders, who were district leaders, individuals representing equity advocates, as well as student populations and demographics. They school improvement experts from across the country, and they reviewed a portfolio, state's portfolio of information. So each state was reviewed by at least between 3 and 5 peers, and they all reviewed that information. And so the information that they reviewed that application, we collected the rubric to grade the quality of that application. We also collected the guidance that states are developing to help districts and schools develop their intervention plan. Guidance included things such as technical manuals, a needs assessment, model exemplary plans, regulations, any type of information to help a district or a school develop their plan was included in our portfolio. We also included additional resources and links. We also partnered with an organization called Education First, or Ed First. That organization surveyed and interviewed over 40 states to get a sense of kind of where they were in their implementation progress, what types of things were states, what changes were they making, how are they approaching school improvement, how is this different under under ESSA versus No Child Left Behind. And so Ed First then took the survey and the interviews and created contextual slides and information, and we put that into the portfolios. We convened the peers in September. A fundamental kind of component of our review was that we needed to be evaluating enough publicly available information. There were only 17 states in our review, of which Massachusetts is included, that had all of this information publicly available. And so the rest of the states had maybe some of this information available. Some states had not updated their websites or updated their information since 2009. So it was kind of being able to determine who we were able to evaluate was a bit of a challenge. Ultimately, 17 states were in our review, and Massachusetts was one of them. The research saying is best practice. From this kind of literature review, we then found at least 8 components that are levers of change for turnaround. We then developed a rubric and vetted it with individuals from the Bush administration, from the Obama administration, school improvement experts, 3 former state chiefs, district leaders, and others to make sure that our questions were accurate, to make sure that they were aligned with the requirements within ESSA, as well as encompassed all the right components of change. Our rubric is available on our website, which I will share with you later. And in addition to the 8 components, we also then had an overall approach, which is, what are the overall weaknesses and strengths for states. We also had an element of how is the state focusing and approaching equity. We defined equity as access and participation to time, money, people, and resources, and funding. And so we really wanted to make sure that states were also focusing we wanted to look at how states were focusing on equity and how they were ensuring that their resources and supports were really geared towards students who are traditionally underserved and making sure that states were as strategic as possible. Curriculum, that their assignments are rigorous and strong. It's really not evident in a majority of the states, I would actually say, that it's just not prioritized, and funding is not geared to those strategies that would work. In addition, we found that many states are not taking their oversight role seriously. So a common theme we found in many of the states is that if a school or district submitted a plan that was complete, so for instance, if they submitted a budget, they got points. They really did not look at quality. So if a school submitted a budget, but that budget was not at all aligned to their improvement plan or why they were identified in the first place, it did not matter, they got funding anyway. So that was something that we found was really alarming, that just states were mostly even states that were allocating funding competitively, they were like, did you submit a complete plan? Great, here's your money. So they did not take advantage of this opportunity in as serious a role as we thought they should. In addition, we found that it was unclear in at least 9 states the degree to which they are utilizing a robust, data-driven process to monitor district implementation. This is a key, fundamental, foundational element of school improvement. How are you making sure that your strategy is working? How are you making sure that you are course correcting throughout the year, throughout the months, throughout the weeks? It's really unclear how this is occurring. In most states, they actually farm this out to another organization, or they let districts partner with other organizations to help them with this monitoring, and that data is then not filtered back up to the state to figure out what is really working. We also found that a strong sustainability plan is missing in most of the states. I think all but one had a strong sustainability kind of plan and structure. We define sustainability as once a school is identified and they then exit identification. They have made enough gains that they are now no longer identified. What plan is being put in place in that school to make sure that they don't then cycle back into identification a year, 2, 5 after leaving? Most of the time, schools just kind of cycle in and out of identification. And oftentimes the way a state sets up their system, it's really just kind of a rejuggling of the lowest 5 to 6% of schools. They exit and then they made gains in a year, then they leave, and then they get identified again a year later, and it's just kind of this perpetual cycle. And there's not really much of a plan in place to work with the schools and district leaders to make sure that they're not dependent upon funding or people to maintain those gains. To get into what is working, what is not, and why. And with that kind of key foundational, that structure of what is working and why is infused throughout most of Massachusetts school improvement work. And so that is kind of their vision that we found that was pretty strong, and that it is aligned to making sure that anything that is done is baked and based on evidence. And so through this, they have their rigorous review process to evaluate school improvement efforts through their work with the American Institutes for Research. One thing we also found that was unique to Massachusetts is in the rubric that the state uses to evaluate the intervention plan that a school or district would submit. A rubric category component actually says students of color, and it evaluates the extent to which the schools use their data from the accountability system or their needs assessment, and their strategy must talk about and describe how they are meeting the needs of students of color. and this sense of urgency. How dedicated is the school to change and to turn around? This was something we did not find in any other state. And so we wanted to point that out as something that was great and something that was unique. We also found that Massachusetts provided a sustainability toolkit for districts and schools. This was something we did not find in any other state in our review. And so these are things that we held up as best practices that is integrated into our report and also through our work. With that, we also found areas for improvement. So while the rubric like Massachusetts was focused primarily on the data and the research and less upon, creating that urgency across the state and that urgency infused throughout their materials. We also found that there was a lot of discrepancies in student outcomes, and so even for the state, even if we know that equity is an issue for all schools. And so we did not find a lot of materials that really looked into how the state was going to support schools that might not have been identified. So maybe you were not in the bottom 5%, but maybe you were in the 6 to 10%. What is the state doing to address those schools? We just did not find a lot of information. And our peers were adamant that if you're going to turn around your school, if you're going to change outcomes within your state, you have to focus on all schools. You cannot just focus only on the lowest 5% because we know that there's inequities within schools and within districts. We also feel that there's more clarity is needed on how and when the state is going to extend the support to these schools, and we think that additional guidance and resources are needed to help districts and schools to effectively engage their stakeholders. We found that there really was not a lot of guidance, if any guidance, provided to schools or districts to help engage their stakeholders. No information was provided on cultural or linguistic diversity, which we found was something was lacking. We also believe that, while Massachusetts' vision is strong and based in evidence, there really was not a coherent call to action to really drive, schools and districts further, or that there was a priority from the state that they want their districts to focus on. It kind of felt as though the state was letting the districts create the strategies that would work, and they would intervene if they didn't make improvements, but that the state was really not driving much of a conversation from their level. They really, are giving more authority to the districts and the schools to come up with their strategy. And the peers think this is great, but they also caution that too much autonomy and too much flexibility without sufficient resources is not going to help the schools or the students. So they really cautioned against this and thought, this is something that that advocates and folks and individuals in the state need to be aware of. Let's see. There was one more. They will be continuing to do this next year. And so one piece that HCM and the Collaborative are committed to doing is to partner with you to continue your advocacy efforts. We're willing to work with you to develop op-eds, social media posts, letters to the editor. Any support that you need, we are available in here to help you out. And so with that, this is our contact information. This is a link to the report. State plans promise to practice, as well as the national report with our recommendations. I believe there's 16 or 17 recommendations in addition to best practices from states, as well as how national findings in each of the rubric categories. And so with that, We are done.
Thank you. You among the other presenters that we've had today, we are so fortunate in that we've had several world-class presentations of information that can be used not just for today. And many of us come from different angles in dealing with the challenges around besting public education so that all students succeed. But whatever angle we're coming from, we can all find data and concepts and ideas from today's presentations that we can use and accentuate and serve as fuel. You know, today the cars are made where you don't have to get tune-ups anymore, right? I mean, the technology is such that they tune themselves up. But think about a car that needs a tune-up. When you had to make that decision to get your car tuned up, it was, you know, periodic. You know, it might be once a year, it could be once every 2 years. But in order for it to run efficiently and effectively, you had to get that tune-up. We hope the sponsors, the Davis Foundation and the Education Trust, and of course the Urban League, we hope that you got a 3E tune-up today, and it inspires you to continue the good fight. You are the choir, so we're preaching to the choir a little bit, but we all can learn. Every time there's a new song, there's a new beat. And we just are so appreciative of the fact that you came out. We had 175 people today. And the precious few get the gems, but because they didn't hear that last presentation. But we're really, I have to, we owe a debt of gratitude to all the volunteers and also the Urban League staff, because they did a yeoman's job in pulling all this together. I think the last thing I want to do is acknowledge again Focus Cable Television for taping this whole conference, this whole summit, which means it will be archived. It's part of the historical archives. We can find a way to get back to it. If you said, no, did Elizabeth say that? Or was that Elizabeth from New Orleans, or was that Elizabeth from D.C.? But we will have that. And again, we want to acknowledge WTCC, because they broadcast the whole summit live. So people who could not get here had an opportunity to get knowledge that way. I want to thank our youth who were called upon to give reflections. Awesome. And we appreciate your candor as well as the uplifting messages that you gave in your presentations. So I think, again, thank everybody for being part of this. And I see Dr. Cook did make it, so thank you. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.